Candide, or optimism. In Westphalia, in the castle of the Baron of Tunda ten Trunk, there lived a young man endowed with the gentlest of characters. Although his judgment was sound, his mind was of the simplest, which is why he was named Candide. The servants at the castle suspected that he was the illegitimate son of the Baron's sister, and of an honourable gentleman of the neighbourhood, whom she could never marry because his nobility was suspect. The Baron himself was one of the most powerful lords in Westphalia. His castle had doors and windows, and his great hall was even adorned with tapestries. The Baroness weighed about 350 pounds, and commanded considerable respect as a result. She did the honours in the house with a dignity that gained her even more respect. Her daughter, Kuniganda, then aged 17, was rosy-complexioned, fresh, plump, and attractive. The Baron's son was in all respects worthy of his father. The children's tutor, Pangloss, was the oracle in the household, and little Candide listened to his lessons with the honesty of his age and character. Pangloss believed that there was no effect without a cause, and that, in the best of all possible worlds, the Baron's castle was the finest of all castles, and his lady the best of all possible baronesses. "It is demonstrated," he declared, "that things cannot be otherwise, for since everything is made for a purpose, everything is necessarily for that purpose. Thus, since noses were made to wear spectacles, we have spectacles. Similarly, stones were formed to be cut and made into castles. So my lord has a very handsome castle, since the greatest baron in the province should be the best housed. Pigs were made to be eaten, so we eat pork all year round. Those who assert that all is well in this world are in error. Rather, they should have said that all is for the best." Candide listened attentively to all of this, and believed in it implicitly. He thought Mademoiselle Kuniganda extremely beautiful, though he had never made so bold as to tell her so. He considered that the greatest happiness was to be born Baron of Tunda ten Trunk, and the second greatest happiness was to be Mademoiselle Kuniganda. The third was to see her every day, and the fourth was to listen to Dr. Pangloss, the greatest philosopher in the whole world. One day Kuniganda, walking near the castle, saw Dr. Pangloss in the bushes, giving a demonstration of experimental physics to her mother's chambermaid, a very pretty and docile little brunette. Since Mademoiselle Kuniganda was attracted to the sciences, she observed breathlessly these repeated experiments. She clearly saw the doctor's demonstration of reason, its causes and effects, and returned home highly agitated and very thoughtful, filled with a desire to demonstrate what she had learned with young Candide. As it happened, she met Candide on the way back to the castle. The next day, after dinner, as everyone was leaving the table, Kuniganda and Candide found themselves alone behind a screen. Kuniganda dropped her handkerchief, and Candide, naturally, picked it up. She innocently took his hand, which the young man just as innocently kissed with very special attentions, sensibility, and grace. Their lips met. Their eyes glowed, their knees trembled, and their hands wandered. The Baron happened to pass by the screen and see this demonstration of cause and effect, so he expelled Candide from the castle with great kicks on his behind. Kuniganda swooned, at which she was slapped in the face by the Baroness. Consternation was rife in the finest and most agreeable of all possible castles. Candide wandered around for a long time without knowing where he was going, weeping, turning his eyes alternately to heaven and then back to the finest of all castles. Eventually he lay down to sleep. Snow was falling in large flakes. The next day Candide, frozen, dragged himself towards the nearby town, penniless and dying of hunger and fatigue. He stopped at an inn where two men dressed in blue noticed him. "Comrade," said one to the other, "there's a well-built young man, and he's of the right height." They advanced towards Candide, and civilly invited him to dinner. "Gentlemen," replied Candide with charming modesty, "you do me a great honor, but I haven't any money with which to pay the bill." "Ah, sir," replied one of the men, "persons of your stature never pay for anything. Am I right in thinking you're 5'5"? Yes, gentlemen, that's exactly my height, confirmed Candide with a bow. Well, sir, let us sit down at table. Not only will we pay your expenses, but we'll always ensure you have enough money. After all, we're made to help one another. You are right, exclaimed Candide. That is just what Monsieur Pangloss always told me, and I clearly see that all is for the best. They urged him to take a few crowns from them, refusing an offer of an IOU in return. Tell me, young sir, do you love someone tenderly? Asked one of the men. Oh, yes, replied Candide. I love Mademoiselle Kuniganda. No, exclaimed the other. What we are really asking is whether you love the king of the Bulgarians. Not at all, came the reply, for I've never seen him. What? But he's the most charming of kings. You must drink his health. Oh, most gladly, gentlemen. Candide drank. That's enough, the pair then said to him. You're now officially the support, the defender, and the hero of the Bulgarians. Your fortune is made, and your glory is assured. They immediately put irons on Candide's legs and took him away to their regiment, where they made him turn right, turn left, raise and lower a ramrod, take aim and fire, march at the double, and they gave him 30 strokes with a stick. The next day Candide drilled a little less badly, and so received only 20 strokes of the stick. The day after that, they gave him only 10, and he is regarded as a prodigy by his comrades. Candide, stupefied, could not yet understand how he was a hero. One fine spring day, he started to go for a stroll, believing that it was a privilege of all humanity to use their legs as they pleased. He had not gone 2 leagues when up came 4 other heroes, 6 feet tall, who overtook him, bound him, and put him in a dungeon. There he was asked to choose between being beaten by the whole regiment or to receive 12 lead bullets in his brain. In vain he told them that since the human will was free, he wanted neither of those. Since he had to make a choice, he decided to run the gauntlet, and this he did twice. Since the regiment was made up of 2,000 men, that meant being given 4,000 strokes of the ramrod, which laid open his muscles and nerves from the nape of his neck to his rump. As they were about to proceed to the 3rd run, Candide, at the end of his tether, asked them as a favor to be kind enough to smash in his head instead, and he was granted this favor. They bandaged his eyes and made him kneel. At that moment, the king of the Bulgarians passed by and made inquiries about the victim's crime. Since the king was a man of great wisdom, he understood that this was a young metaphysician, very ignorant of the ways of the world, and so he granted him his pardon. A skilled surgeon cured Candide in 3 weeks, and by the time he had recovered a little of his skin and could walk again, the king of the Bulgarians was at war with the king of the Barbarians. Nothing could have been so beautiful, so brilliant, so well drilled as the armies of the Bulgarians and the Barbarians. At first the cannons felled about 6,000 men on each side. Then the musketry removed from the best of worlds a further 9,000 or 10,000. And then the bayonet caused the death of many thousands of men. In total, this show of reason accounted for some 30,000 souls. Candide, trembling like a philosopher, hid himself as best he could during this heroic butchery. Finally, he decided to venture out to learn more about causes and effects. He passed over heaps of dead and dying to reach an Barbarian village, which was in ashes, since the Bulgarians had burned it to the ground in accordance with the rules of international law. Here, men riddled with wounds watched their wives die, holding their children. Other girls, disemboweled after satisfying the natural needs of a select number of heroes, were gasping their last sighs. Others, half-burned, screamed to be given the coup de grace. At this, Candide fled at full speed to another village, which belonged to the Bulgarians, and which the Barbarian heroes had treated in the same way as the previous village. Candide, treading on quivering limbs or through ruins, arrived at last outside the theatre of war, carrying a few provisions in his knapsack, and never having once forgotten Mademoiselle Kuniganda. His provisions ran out by the time he reached Holland, but having heard that everyone in that country was rich and Christian, he had no doubt he would be treated well. He asked for alms from several severe-looking persons, who replied that if he continued to beg, he would be imprisoned in a house of correction. He then addressed a man who had just talked about charity for a solid hour to a large assembly. "And what brings you here? Are you here for a good cause?" asked the orator. "There is no effect without a cause," replied Candide modestly. "Everything is linked by necessity and arranged for the best. So it was necessary for me to be expelled from the castle, and to have run the gauntlet, and to have to beg my bread until I can earn it. All this could not have happened differently." "My friend," commented the orator, "do you believe that the Pope is the Antichrist?" "I've never heard that before," replied Candide. "But whether he is or not, I still have no bread." "You do not deserve it," stated the other. "Be off with you, scoundrel, wretch! Never come anywhere near me again." The orator's wife put her head out of the window, and seeing a man who doubted the Pope was Antichrist, poured a full chamber pot on his head. Heavens, such religious zeal! A man named Jacques saw this cruel and ignominious treatment accorded to Candide, and took him home, cleaned him up, and gave him some bread and beer. Afterwards he made Candide a present of 2 florins, and even offered him work in his carpet factory. Dr. Pangloss was certainly right to tell me that all is for the best in this world, for I am infinitely more touched by the extreme generosity of Jacques than by the harshness of that gentleman in the black coat and his wife, reflected Candide. The next day, while out on a walk, Candide met a beggar covered with sores. His eyes were as dull as death, and the end of his nose had been eaten away. His mouth was awry, and his teeth were black. This wretch was also tormented by a violent cough, which spluttered out a tooth at every spasm. Candide, moved even more by compassion than by horror, gave this frightful beggar the 2 florins he had received from Jacques. The phantom gazed fixedly at him for a moment, then cried out, and threw his arms round Candide's neck. Candide recoiled in terror. "Alas," said the wretch, "don't you recognize your dear Pangloss any more?" "Is it really you, dear master? You in this horrible state? What misfortune has happened to you? Why are you no longer in the finest of castles? What has become of Mademoiselle Kuniganda, the masterpiece of nature?" "I'm exhausted," gasped Pangloss. Candide immediately took him to Jacques' stable, where he made him eat a little bread. When Pangloss had recovered a little, he repeated, "Well, how is Kuniganda?" "She's dead." Candide fainted, but his friend restored him to consciousness with a little bad vinegar. Candide opened his eyes. "Kuniganda is dead? Ah, best of worlds, where are you? What illness did she die of? Was it a result of my expulsion from the finest of castles?" "No," replied Pangloss. "Actually, she was disemboweled by Bulgarian soldiers, after being raped as much as anyone could be. They smashed in the head of the Baron. The Baroness was cut to pieces. My other poor pupil was treated precisely like his sister. And as for the castle, not a stone was left standing. But we have been well avenged, for the Barbarians did the same in a neighboring barony that belonged to a Bulgarian." At this news Candide swooned again, but soon recovered and said that everything was as it should be. He then inquired further about cause and effect, specifically the reason for Pangloss being in this pitiful state. "Alas," explained Pangloss, "it was love. Love, the consoler of the human race, the soul of all emotional beings." "I also have known this love, and all it has ever brought me is 1 kiss and 20 kicks on the behind. But how could this beautiful cause produce so dreadful an effect? My dear Candide, you knew Paquette, the pretty lady-in-waiting. In her arms I experienced the delights of paradise, but which produced these torments with which you see me devoured, for she was infected. I believe Paquette had received this present from a learned Franciscan, who had got it from an old countess, who had received it from a cavalry captain, who owed it to a marquise, who had it from a page, who received it from a Jesuit, who as a novice got it in a direct line from one of Christopher Columbus's companions. For my part, I shall give it to no one, for I am dying. Oh, Pangloss! Exclaimed Candide. What a strange genealogy! Surely the devil was at the root of it. Not at all. It was an indispensable ingredient in this best of worlds. This malady is peculiar to our continent, like religious controversy. The Turks, the Indians, the Persians, the Chinese, the Siamese, the Japanese are not yet acquainted with it, although there appears no reason why they should not make its acquaintance within the next few centuries. Meanwhile, it has made marvelous progress among us, especially in great armies composed of decent, well-brought-up mercenaries, which decide the destinies of states. How admirable! Exclaimed Candide. But we must get you cured. How can I be? Asked Pangloss. I haven't a sou, and around the whole circumference of this globe you cannot see a doctor without having to pay for it. This last speech made up Candide's mind. He went back to the charitable Jacques and conveyed such a touching picture of his friend that the good man had no hesitation in taking in Dr. Pangloss, whom he had cured at his own expense. During the cure, Pangloss lost only 1 eye and 1 ear. As Pangloss wrote with a good hand, and knew arithmetic perfectly, the good Jacques made him his bookkeeper. 2 months later, having to go to Lisbon on business, he took his 2 philosophers with him. Although Pangloss had explained to him how everything was for the best, Jacques did not share this opinion. Surely, he said, man has corrupted nature. Men were not born wolves, and yet they have become wolves. God gave them neither 24-pounder cannon nor bayonets, and yet they have made cannon and bayonets to destroy one another. These things are indispensable, replied the one-eyed doctor. Anyway, the sum of private misfortune add up to the general good. The more private misfortunes there are, so the better things are. While Pangloss was reasoning thus, the sky darkened and the winds blew. The ship was struck by a most horrible tempest while in sight of the port of Lisbon. Half the passengers, dreadfully weakened by seasickness, did not even have the strength to worry about their danger. The other half screamed and prayed. The ship's sails were torn and the mast shattered. Those who could worked, but no one coordinated these efforts, and there was no one in command. While Jacques was helping with this work on the main deck, a frenzied sailor struck him and laid him out on the planks. The sailor got such a jolt from this blow that he himself fell out of the ship head first. He caught hold of a piece of the broken mast, dangling from it. The good Jacques, quickly recovering, ran to his aid and helped him climb back up, but in the effort was flung into the sea in full view of the sailor, who let him perish without even deigning to look at him. Candide watched as his benefactor came up for a moment, and then saw him swallowed up forever by the sea. At first he wanted to throw himself into the sea after him, but Pangloss stopped him, proving to him that the Lisbon Narrows had been formed expressly for Jacques to be drowned in. While he was demonstrating this logic, the ship split open and everyone perished, with the exception of Pangloss, Candide, and the sailor, who had allowed the virtuous Jacques to drown. Pangloss and Candide were carried to the shore on a plank. When they had recovered a little, they walked towards Lisbon. They only had a little money left, which they hoped would save them from hunger. Hardly had they set foot in the city, still mourning over the death of their benefactor, when they felt the earth tremble under their feet. The sea started to boil in the port and smashed the vessels that were at anchor there. Whirlwinds of flame and ash covered the streets and public squares. Houses crumbled, the roofs tumbling down onto the foundations, and the foundations themselves disintegrated. 30,000 inhabitants were crushed beneath the ruins. The sailor, who had landed with them, whistling and swearing, said, "There'll be something to pick up here." "What can be the reason for this phenomenon?" Candide asked Pangloss. "It's the end of the world," his companion explained simply. The sailor ran into the middle of the debris, braving death to find money. Finding some, he got drunk, and once he had slept, bought the favors of the first girl of goodwill he met among the ruins, among the dying and the dead. Pangloss tugged at this rogue's sleeve. "My friend," he protested, "this is not good. You're choosing your time badly." "So what? I'm a sailor. You and your universal reason. Push off!" Meanwhile, Candide had been wounded by splinters of stone and lay stretched out in the street, covered with debris. He pleaded with Pangloss, "Get me a little wine, for I'm dying." "Earthquakes are not a new thing, you know," remarked Pangloss. "The town of Lima suffered similar shocks this year. The same causes, the same effects. There's certain to be a vein of sulphur running underground from Lima to Lisbon." "Nothing is more probable," replied Candide. "But for the love of God, fetch me a little wine." "What do you mean, probable?" countered the philosopher. "I've just proved it." Candide lost consciousness, so Pangloss went to fetch him a little water from a neighboring fountain. The next day, having found some food as they stepped through the ruins, their strength was restored a little. They then set to work to help the inhabitants who had escaped death, some of whom gave them as good a dinner as could be expected following such a disaster. True, the meal was sad, with the guests crying over their bread, but Pangloss consoled them by assuring them that things could not be otherwise. "For all this is for the very best. If there is a volcano in Lisbon, it could not be anywhere else," he declared. A small dark man, connected with the Inquisition, who sat beside him, spoke up politely. "Apparently you do not believe in original sin, for if all is for the best, then man has neither fallen nor been punished." "I beg your Excellency's pardon," replied Pangloss politely. "Surely the fall of man was necessary for us to enter into the best of possible worlds." "Then you do not believe in free will?" "If your Excellency will excuse me," continued Pangloss, "free will can only coexist with absolute necessity, for it was necessary that we should be free." While Pangloss was in the middle of his explanation, the small, dark man nodded to his armed attendant. After the earthquake, which destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, Portugal's rulers could find no better means of preventing total ruin than to give the people a fine auto da fe. They decided that the spectacle of a few persons slowly being burnt in a great public ceremony would be an infallible means for preventing further earthquakes. They therefore seized a man from Biscay, convicted of having married his godchild's godmother, and 2 Portuguese, who were believed Jews. These same men came and bound Dr. Pangloss and his disciple Candide, the one for what he said, the other for having listened with an air of approval. Both were taken to prison. A week later they were dressed as condemned heretics, and their heads were adorned with paper mitres. They were then marched in procession to hear a pathetic sermon, followed by beautiful music sung in a droning plain song. Candide was flogged in time to the singing, while the man from Biscay and the 2 Jews from Portugal were burned. Pangloss was hanged, although this was not normally the custom. Teeming rain had extinguished the flames. Candide was then released. On the same day, the earth quaked again with a fearful noise. Candide, terrified, dumbfounded, and bewildered, still bleeding and quivering all over from his flogging, said to himself, "If this is the best of all possible worlds, then what are the others like? My dear Pangloss, greatest of all philosophers, was it necessary for one to see you hanged without knowing why? Jacques, best of men, why was it necessary that you be drowned in the port? Mademoiselle Kuniganda, sweetest of young ladies, why was it necessary that your tummy should have been slit open?" While he was murmuring these thoughts, an old woman came up to him and whispered, "My son, take courage. Follow me." Candide did not take courage, but he followed the old woman nonetheless into a hovel, where she gave him a jar of ointment to rub on his wounds, and left him food and drink. She then showed him a neat little bed beside the doorway. "Eat, drink, and sleep," she ordered. "May Our Lady and the saints take care of you. I shall be back tomorrow." Candide, already astounded at all he had seen and had suffered, was even more astounded at the old woman's charity, and tried to kiss her hand. She repeated, "I'll come back. Meanwhile, rub yourself with the ointment." Candide, despite all his misfortunes, ate and slept well. The next day, the old woman brought him his breakfast, examined his back, rubbed it with another ointment, and then left. Later on, she brought him dinner, returning towards evening to bring his supper. The day after, she went through the same routine. "Who are you?" Candide kept asking her. "Who has inspired you with such kindness? How can I possibly thank you?" The woman never replied. One evening she returned, but brought him no supper. "Come with me," she commanded. "Don't say a word." She took him by the arm and walked with him into the country for about a quarter of a mile. Eventually they arrived at an isolated house, surrounded by gardens and canals. She knocked on a little door. When it opened, she took Candide up a hidden staircase into a golden boudoir, where she left him sitting on a sofa. Candide thought he was dreaming. Some time later, the old woman reappeared, supporting a trembling young woman of majestic stature, gleaming with precious stones and covered with a veil. "Remove the veil," ordered the old woman. Candide approached the young lady timidly, but removed the veil. What a moment! What a surprise! It's Mademoiselle Kuniganda! Candide falls at Kuniganda's feet, while Kuniganda herself falls backwards onto the sofa. The old woman plied them with aromatic spirits so that they regained their senses, and then left them by themselves. "Is it really you?" exclaimed Candide. "You're alive! Your belly was not split open, as Pangloss assured me." "Oh, yes," replied the fair Kuniganda. "But not everyone dies of such accidents." "But were your father and mother and brother killed?" "Unfortunately so," replied Kuniganda, weeping. "Why are you in Portugal? How did you learn I was here? How did you have me brought to this house?" "I'll tell you all. But first, you must tell me everything that has happened to you since you gave me that innocent kiss and received the kicks in your behind." Candide told her everything that had happened. Kuniganda kept raising her eyes to heaven, and she cried on hearing of the death of Jacques and Pangloss. Once Candide had finished, she in her turn told him of her experiences. "I was in bed, fast asleep, when it pleased God to send the Bulgarians to our fine castle. They slaughtered my father and cut my mother into pieces. A big Bulgarian, seeing that I had lost consciousness at the sight of this, set about raping me, which brought me to. I screamed, I struggled, I bit, I scratched, and I tried to tear that big Bulgarian's eyes out, not knowing that everything that was happening was just custom. The brute had just stabbed me with his knife when a Bulgarian captain came in and saw me. He was angry at the lack of respect this brute showed me and killed him. He then had my wounds dressed and took me to his quarters as a prisoner of war. I laundered the shirts he had and did his cooking. After 3 months, having lost all his money as well as his liking for me, he sold me to a Jew named Don Issachar, a merchant trading in Holland and Portugal. He had a passionate love for women, but I resisted him for longer than I did the Bulgarian soldier. The Jew, hoping to tame me, brought me to this house. One day, the Grand Inquisitor noticed me at Mass. He eyed me a great deal, and then sent word that he had secret affairs to speak to me about, and so it was proposed to Don Issachar that he give me to his lordship. Don Issachar, who is the court banker and a man of influence, refused, so the Inquisitor threatened him with an auto da fe. Finally, my Jew made a bargain by which both the house and I would belong to them both. The Jew would have me on Mondays, Wednesdays, and the Sabbath, and the Inquisitor would have me the other days of the week. This agreement has lasted for 6 months. For my part, so far, I have resisted them both, and I think that is the reason why I am still loved by them. Recently, in order to prevent the earthquakes and to intimidate Don Issachar, the Inquisitor has revived the auto da fe, to which he did me the honor of inviting me, where I had a very good seat. I was seized with horror, seeing them burn those 2 Jews and the worthy Biscayan. However, that was nothing to my surprise, my fright, and my distress when I saw Pangloss. I rubbed my eyes, watching attentively, and I saw him hanged. I fell into a faint, and had scarcely regained my senses when I saw you, stripped naked. My horror, consternation, grief, and despair were at their height. I cried out, trying to say, "Stop!" and "Barbarians!" But my voice failed me, and my cries would have been useless anyway. While you were being flogged, I asked myself, how can it be that the charming Candide and the wise Pangloss are in Lisbon, one to receive 100 lashes and the other to be hanged by order of my lord the Inquisitor, whose dearly beloved I am? I concluded that Pangloss had deceived me most cruelly when he told me that all is for the very best. Above all, I thought of the kiss I gave you behind the screen. I praised God for bringing you back to me after so many tribulations, and I ordered my old servant woman to take care of you and to bring you here as soon as she could. Now I have enjoyed the inexpressible pleasure of seeing you again, hearing you, speaking to you. But you must be ravenously hungry. Let's have supper. After supper they resumed their places on the handsome sofa, and were still there when Don Issachar arrived. Since it was the Sabbath, he was coming to enjoy his shared rights and expound his tender love to Kuniganda. "What?" he cried. "Bitch of a Galilean? So the Inquisitor isn't enough for you. This scoundrel must share with me too." Don Issachar drew out a long dagger, which he always carried, and, not thinking whether his adversary was armed, threw himself upon Candide. However, our good Westphalian had received a fine sword from the old servant woman, which he drew, and although Candide had a very gentle character, he soon had the Israelite stretched out, stone-dead on the floor. "Holy Virgin!" cried Kuniganda. "What's to become of us? If the law arrives, we're lost." "If Pangloss had not been hanged," said Candide, "he'd have been able to give us some good advice, for he was a great philosopher. But since he's no longer with us, let's consult the old woman." The servant was just beginning to give her advice when another door opened. By now, Sunday was just beginning, and since that day belonged to my lord the Inquisitor, he now appears. At this turn of events, Candide reasoned to himself, if this holy man calls for help, he will have me burned without fail. He may even do the same to Kuniganda. He has had me pitilessly whipped already, but now he is my rival. Since I have started killing, I must not hesitate any longer. Candide's reasoning was clear-cut and swift. Without giving the Inquisitor any time to recover from his surprise, he pierced him through with the sword and tossed him beside the Jew. "Now here's another corpse," exclaimed Kuniganda. "Now there's no possibility of a pardon. We will be excommunicated. How could you be so mild, Candide, and yet manage to kill a Jew and an Inquisitor in the space of 2 minutes?" "My dear lady," replied Candide, "when a man is in love and has been whipped by the Inquisition, he is not responsible for his actions." The old woman spoke up and advised, "There are 3 horses in the stable, saddled and bridled. Let's quickly set off for Cadiz. The weather could not be fairer, and it's a great pleasure to travel in the cool of the night." Very soon Kuniganda, the old woman, and Candide were travelling 30 miles at one stretch. As they were riding away, the Holy Brotherhood arrived in the house. They subsequently buried his lordship in a beautiful church, while they tossed Don Isaac's body on the dump. By this time Candide, Kuniganda, and the old woman had arrived in the small town of Avenca, in the middle of the Sierra Morena, where they rested for a while in an inn. The next day they reached Cadiz and prepared for embarkation. "Who's stolen my money and my diamonds?" cried Kuniganda tearfully when she looked at her baggage. "Now what shall we live on? What shall we do? Where can we find other Inquisitors and Jews to give me more?" "Alas," replied the old woman, "I strongly suspect the Reverend Franciscan who slept in the inn with us yesterday. He came into our room twice, and left long before us." The good Pangloss often reasoned to me that the goods of the earth are common to all men, and that everyone has an equal right to them. The Franciscan, according to these principles, should certainly have left us enough to complete our trip. "Have you nothing left at all, my fair Kuniganda?" asked Candide. "Not a penny." "What shall we do then?" asked Candide. "Let's sell one of the horses," decided the old woman. A Benedictine prior bought their horses at a bargain price. In Cadiz, a fleet was being equipped, and troops assembled to subdue the reverend Jesuit fathers in Paraguay, who were accused of inciting the Indian tribes to revolt against Spain and Portugal. Candide, having served with the Bulgarians, performed the Bulgarian drill with so much grace, celerity, pride, and agility in front of the general on the quayside, that he was immediately given an infantry company to command, of which he was to be captain. So it was that Candide embarked with Mademoiselle Kuniganda, the old woman, 2 valets, and the 2 Andalusian horses. During the crossing, they argued a great deal about the philosophy of the poor Pangloss. "Since we are going to a new world," announced Candide, "no doubt it will prove to be the one where all is well. For it must be admitted that one might criticize what has happened to us in our old world." "I love you with all my heart," said Kuniganda, "but my soul is still frightened by what I have seen and experienced." "All will be well," assured Candide, "for it must be the new world that is the best of possible worlds." "God grant it," said Kuniganda, "but I have been so horribly unhappy in the old one that my heart is almost without hope." "You complain too much," the old woman said to them. "At least you have not suffered misfortunes such as mine." Kuniganda thought this good woman must be joking, to claim to be more unfortunate than herself. "Alas," she said, "I don't see that you can outdo me. Remember that I was born a baroness, and I am now a cook." "My lady," replied the old woman, You know nothing of my birth, and if I showed you my bottom, you would not speak as you do." This speech aroused extreme curiosity in Candide and Kuniganda, so the old woman continued. "My eyes were not always bloodshot and red-rimmed. My nose did not always touch my chin, and I was not always a servant. I am the daughter of Pope Urban and the Princess of Palestrina. Until the age of 14, I was brought up in a palace, compared with which the castles of your German barons are stables. I grew in beauty, graces, and talents. Even at a very young age, I inspired love. I was betrothed to the Prince of Massa Carrara. What a prince! So handsome, full of sweetness and charm, agleam with wit and afire with love. I loved him with idolatrous frenzy. The pomp, the magnificence of the wedding was unheard of. There were continual festivities. The moment of my happiness was at hand, when an old marquise, who had been my prince's mistress, invited him to have some chocolate at her house. In less than 2 hours, he died in frightful convulsions. My mother, in despair, decided to leave such a fateful place. She had a very beautiful estate near Gaeta, so we embarked in a local galley. Suddenly, a pirate from Salé swooped down on us and boarded our ship. Our soldiers defended themselves in a manner one would expect from soldiers of the Pope. They fell on their knees, threw down their arms, and begged the pirates for mercy. The pirates had them stripped naked as monkeys, together with my mother, our ladies-in-waiting, and myself. The diligence with which those raiders undress people is truly a wonderful thing. You may imagine how we all suffered in that pirate ship. The Princess of Palestrina and myself had to be very strong to endure everything we underwent while we journeyed to Morocco. Morocco was swimming in blood when we arrived. Each of the 50 sons of the Emperor Ismail headed a separate faction, which produced 50 separate civil wars, so there was continual carnage through the empire. Hardly had we landed when some blacks, from a faction hostile to that of the pirates, came up to us. I was witness to a combat in which they fought with the fury of the lions, tigers, and snakes of the country to see who should have us. One Moor seized my mother by the right arm, while the captain's lieutenant held her back by the left arm. A Moorish soldier took her by one leg, while one of the pirates held her by the other. In a moment, all our girls found themselves being pulled about in this way. My pirate captain kept me hidden behind him. He had his scimitar in his hand and was killing everything that came in front of him. Finally, I saw all our women and my mother massacred by the monsters who were fighting over them. My pirate captain and his men were all killed. I myself lay dying on a heap of dead. However, I managed to extricate myself with great difficulty from the press of the bleeding corpses and dragged myself beneath a big orange tree at the edge of the nearby stream. There I collapsed from fright, weariness, horror, despair, and hunger. Soon afterwards, my exhausted senses gave themselves up to a deep sleep. Suddenly, I felt something pressing against me, and moving my body, I opened my eyes and saw a handsome white man who was sighing and muttering in Italian. Astounded and delighted to hear the language of my homeland, and no less surprised by his actions, I informed him in a few words of the horrors I had suffered, and then I fell back into a faint. He took me to a neighboring house, where he had me put to bed and given food, served me, consoled me, flattered me, and told me he had never seen anyone as beautiful as I. He told me of his own adventures, saying that he had been sent by a Christian power to the King of Morocco to conclude a treaty to buy gunpowder, cannon, and ships to help exterminate other Christians. He promised that once his mission was complete, he would take me back to Italy. I thanked him tearfully, but instead of taking me back to Italy, he carried me off to Algiers and there sold me to the Dey of that province. Hardly was I sold when the plague, which had spread all over Africa, Asia, and Europe, broke out in Algiers. I know you've seen earthquakes, but have you ever seen the plague? Never, replied Kuniganda and Candide together. If you had it, the old woman continued, you'd have to admit that it's far worse than any earthquake. I was struck down with it, but did not die, although my Dey and almost the entire seraglio of Algiers perished. When the first ravages of this frightful plague were over, the Dey's slaves were sold. A merchant bought me and took me to Tunis, where he sold me to another merchant, who resold me in Tripoli. From Tripoli, I was resold to Alexandria. From Alexandria, resold to Smyrna. From Smyrna to Constantinople. Finally, I belonged to an aga of the guards of the Turkish Sultan, who was soon ordered to go and defend Azor against the Russians, who were besieging it. The aga, who was a very gallant man, took his whole seraglio with him and lodged us in a fort guarded by 2 black eunuchs and 20 soldiers. They killed a prodigious number of Russians, but they repaid us with interest. Azor was razed to the ground, except for our little fort. Then the enemy tried to subdue us by starving us out. 20 Janissaries had sworn never to surrender, but the extremities of hunger forced them to eat 2 eunuchs for fear of breaking their promise. A few days later, they decided to eat the women. We had with us a very pious and very compassionate imam, who preached them a fine sermon in which he exhorted them not to kill us completely, but instead to just cut off 1 slice from each of these ladies, and even if you have to come back for more, you'll have as much again in a few days. Heaven will be pleased with you for so charitable an action, and you will be rescued. His great eloquence persuaded them. Scarcely had the Janissaries eaten the meal we had supplied them with when the Russians arrived. Not 1 Janissary escaped, nor did the Russians pay the slightest attention to the state we were in. However, there were French surgeons everywhere, and one of them, who was very skillful, took care of us. As soon as myself and my companions could walk, we were sent to Moscow. I fell to the lot of a Russian nobleman, who made me his gardener and gave me 20 lashes a day. However, when this lord was broken on the wheel 2 years later for some petty fuss at court, I profited by his misadventure by fleeing. I crossed the whole of Russia and eventually reached Rotterdam. There, I grew old miserably, remembering that I was the daughter of a pope. 100 times I considered killing myself, but I still loved life, although this ridiculous foible is perhaps one of our most disastrous inclinations. In the countries that fate has driven me through, and in the inns where I have served, I have seen a prodigious number of persons who loathe their existence, but have seen only 12 who voluntarily put an end to their misery. I ended up being a servant to the Jew, Don Issachar. Now, my fair young lady, I have attached myself to your destiny, and I have since been more concerned with your adventures than with mine. I would never have spoken to you of my misfortunes if you had not irritated me a little, and if it were not customary on board ship to tell stories to conquer boredom. I know the world. Have some fun by getting each passenger to tell you his story. If there is a single one who has not often cursed his life, and who has not often said that he was the unhappiest of men, then throw me into the sea." The fair Kuniganda, having heard the old woman's story, showed her all the courtesy due to a person of her rank and merit. She accepted the old woman's challenge, and got all the passengers to tell her their adventures. Candide and she had to admit that the old woman was right. "It's a great pity," remarked Candide, "that the wise Pangloss was hanged, contrary to the custom at an auto da fe, for he would have been able to tell us wonderful things about the physical and moral evils that cover the earth and sea. I might even feel strong enough to respectfully offer him a few objections." As each passenger was telling his story, the vessel moved on, and eventually they landed in Buenos Aires. Kuniganda, Candide, and the old woman called on the governor, Don Fernando y Souza. This lord spoke with the noblest disdain, holding his nose so high, raising his voice so pitilessly, assuming so imposing a tone, affecting so lofty a bearing, that anyone who talked to him felt like giving him a beating. He loved women with a frenzy, and Kuniganda seemed to him to be the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The first thing he did was to ask if she was Captain Candide's wife. The manner in which he asked this question alarmed Candide, but he did not dare say she was his wife or sister, because she was neither. His soul was too pure to be untruthful. "Mademoiselle Kuniganda," he admitted, "is going to do me the honor of marrying me. We humbly request your excellency to perform the wedding ceremony." Don Fernando y Souza, twirling his moustache, smiled, then ordered Captain Candide to return to his company. Candide obeyed, while the governor remained with Mademoiselle Kuniganda. He immediately declared his passion to her, saying that the next day he would marry her publicly in church. Kuniganda asked him for a quarter of an hour to reflect on this ultimatum, and in order to consult the old woman. The old woman advised Kuniganda, "My lady, you have noble birth and yet not a penny. You could now be the wife of the greatest lord in South America, who, after all, has a very handsome moustache. Why should you pride yourself on your invincible fidelity? I must admit that if I were in your place, I would have no scruple over marrying my lord the governor and thereby making Captain Candide's fortune." While the old woman was speaking, with all the prudence that age and experience gives, a little vessel was seen to enter the port, where it discharged a municipal official and some police officers. The old woman had guessed correctly that it was the long-sleeved Franciscan who had stolen Kuniganda's money and jewels. He had subsequently tried to sell some of the precious stones to a jeweler who had recognized the pieces as belonging to the Grand Inquisitor. The Franciscan, before being hanged, admitted that he had stolen the jewels, and described the persons from whom they had been stolen, and the route they were taking. Candide and Kuniganda's flight was therefore well known, and they were followed to Cadiz, from where a ship was hastily dispatched in pursuit of them. This ship was the one that had just entered the port. The old woman knew what had to be done. "You cannot flee," she advised Kuniganda. "You have nothing to fear, since it was not you who killed his lordship. Besides, the governor, who loves you, will not allow you to be maltreated, so I would advise you to stay put." The old woman then immediately ran to Candide. "Flee," she ordered, "or you'll be burned within the hour." There wasn't a moment to lose, but how could Candide part with Kuniganda, and where was he to take refuge? Candide had brought with him from Cadiz a valet of the type often found on the coasts of Spain and in the colonies. His name was Cacambo, and he loved his master very much, because his master was a very good man. He saddled their 2 Andalusian horses as quickly as possible. "Come, master, take the old woman's advice. Let's make a run for it." Candide burst into tears. "But my darling Kuniganda, must I abandon you just as the governor was going to perform our marriage? Kuniganda, brought here from afar. What will become of you?" "She'll get along as best she can," replied Cacambo. "Women are never at a loss, for God looks after them. Let's go." "Where are you taking me?" asked Candide. "By St. James of Compostela," cried Cacambo. "You were going to make war on the Jesuits. Instead, let's make war for them. I know the roads well enough. I'll take you to their kingdom. They'll be delighted to have a captain who can drill Bulgarian style. You'll make a fortune. When you don't get your due in one world, you'll find it in another, and it is such a pleasure to see and do new things." "Then you have been to Paraguay before?" asked Candide. "Oh, yes, indeed," replied Cacambo. "I was a servant in the College of the Assumption. I know the government of the fathers as well as I know the streets of Cadiz. It's an admirable thing, their government. The fathers have everything, and the people have nothing. It's a masterpiece of reason and justice. For my part, I know nothing as divine as the fathers, who here make war on the King of Spain and the King of Portugal, and who in Europe protect those same kings. Here they kill Spaniards, and yet in Madrid send them to heaven. It enchants me. But let's get on, so you can be the happiest of men. What pleasure the fathers will have when they learn that a captain is coming who knows Bulgarian drill." As soon as they had reached the border, Cacambo told the outpost that a captain wished to speak to the commandant. First, Candide and Cacambo were disarmed, and their 2 Andalusian horses were seized. The 2 strangers were brought into the camp, passing between 2 ranks of soldiers, at the end of which they saw the commandant, half-pike in hand. He made a sign, and immediately soldiers surrounded the 2 newcomers. A sergeant ordered them to be silent until the Reverend Provincial Father arrived, since he did not permit any Spaniard to open his mouth except in his presence. "Where is the Reverend Provincial Father, then?" asked Cacambo. "He'll join the parade once he's said Mass," replied the sergeant. "He'll not be able to kiss his spurs until at least 3 hours from now." "But," protested Cacambo, "the captain who is dying of hunger is not a Spaniard, he's a German. Can we not have breakfast while we're waiting for his reverence?" The sergeant immediately reported all this to the commandant. "Praise God," responded the commandant. "Since he's German, I can speak to him. Bring him over to me." Candide was immediately taken into a leafy bower, adorned with a very pretty colonnade in green and gold marble. An excellent breakfast was ready in vessels of gold. While the Paraguayans ate corn out of wooden bowls in the open fields in the full blaze of the sun, the Reverend Father Commandant ducked into his cool arbor. He was a very handsome young man, full-faced, white-skinned, his manner proud, but with a pride that was neither that of a Spaniard nor that of a Jesuit. Candide and Cacambo were given back their arms, as well as their 2 horses. Cacambo fed them oats and constantly kept his eye on them in case of surprise. Candide kissed the hem of the commandant's robe, then sat down to table. "So you're a German?" the Jesuit asked in German. "Yes, Reverend Father," confirmed Candide. "What part of Germany are you from?" "From the filthy province of Westphalia," answered Candide. "I was born in the castle of Tundertentrunk." "Heavens!" cried the commandant. "What a miracle!" cried Candide. "Can it be you?" asked the Jesuit. "It's not possible," said Candide. They both fell over backwards, they embraced, they shed torrents of tears. "What, you, Reverend Father? Can you really be the brother of fair Kuniganda? Were you not killed by the Bulgarians? You, now a Jesuit in Paraguay? This world's a strange thing. Oh, Pangloss, Pangloss, how happy you would be if you had not been hanged." The commandant sent the Negro slaves and the Paraguayans away. He then thanked God and St. Ignatius 1,000 times. He clasped Candide in his arms. Their faces were bathed in tears. "What, you, Reverend Father? Can you really be the brother of fair Kuniganda? Were you not killed by the Bulgarians?" "You, now a Jesuit in Paraguay?" "Yes, Reverend Father," confirmed Candide. "I was born in the castle of Tundertentrunk." "Heavens!" cried the commandant. "What a miracle!" "You would have been even more astounded, more touched, more beside yourself," said Candide, "if I told you that Mademoiselle Kuniganda, your sister, whom you thought disemboweled, is in good health." "Where?" "Not far from here, with the governor of Buenos Aires. And to think I was coming to make war on you." Every word they uttered in the course of their long conversation added another marvel to the marvels already told. Since they were Germans, they stayed long at the table, during which the commandant told his tale to his dear Candide. "All my life I'll remember that awful day when I saw my father and mother killed and my sister raped. When the Bulgarians withdrew, my sister could not be found. So my mother, father, and I, together with 2 serving girls and 3 little boys who had been slaughtered, were put into a cart to be taken for burial in a nearby Jesuit chapel. A Jesuit threw holy water on us. It was horribly salty, and a few drops got into my eyes. The father noticed a tiny flicker of my eyelid, so he put his hand on my heart and felt it beating. And so I was rescued, and after 3 weeks, it was as though nothing had happened. You remember, my dear Candide, that I was very handsome. Well, the Reverend Father Crust, superior at the monastery, conceived the most tender friendship for me. He gave me the tunic of a novice, and sometime later I was sent to Rome. Since the rulers of Paraguay welcome as few Spanish Jesuits as they can, as they prefer foreigners, I was considered a suitable candidate to go and labor in this vineyard. On arriving, I was honored with a subdeaconate and a lieutenancy. Today, I'm a colonel and a priest. When they arrive, we'll give the King of Spain's troops a vigorous reception. I'm certain they'll all be excommunicated and beaten, especially since Providence sends you here to second us. Perhaps, my dear Candide, we will enter the city together as conquerors and regain my sister Kuniganda." "That's all that I could wish for," said Candide, "for I was counting on marrying her, and still hope to." "You insolent wretch," replied the Baron. "You have the impudence to marry my noble sister? I'm amazed at your effrontery." Candide replied, "Reverend Father, nobility has nothing to do with it. I saved your sister from the arms of a Jew and an Inquisitor. She has obligations enough towards me, and she wants to marry me. Dr. Pangloss always told me that all men were equal, and so I shall certainly marry her." "We'll see about that, you scoundrel!" cried the Jesuit, and he struck Candide a blow on the face with the flat of his sword. That same instant, Candide drew his own sword and thrust it up to the hilt into the Jesuit's belly. But as he drew it out, he began to weep. "Alas, good Lord," he said, "I've killed my former master, my friend, my brother-in-law. I'm the kindest man in the world, and yet I've already killed 3 men, 2 of whom were priests." Cacambo, who had been standing watch at the entrance to the arbor, ran up. "There's nothing left but to defend ourselves," Candide told him. "No doubt others will be coming. We must die arms in hand." Unlike his master, Cacambo, who had been in situations like this before, did not lose his head. He took the Jesuit robe worn by the Baron and put it over Candide's, and also gave him the dead man's beretta. Hurriedly, he made Candide mount his horse. "Let's gallop, master," cried Cacambo. "Everyone will think you're a Jesuit, and so we'll be able to cross the frontier before they come after us." The valet was already in full flight as he uttered these words. He shouted out in Spanish, make way for the Reverend Father Colonel." Candide and his valet crossed the frontier before anyone in the Jesuit camp knew of the attack on their commander. The efficient Cacambo had taken care to fill his bag with bread, chocolate, ham, fruit, and several bottles of wine before they had fled. The 2 plunged on into the unknown land until there appeared before them a beautiful meadow crossed by streams, where our two travelers paused to give food to their mounts and have their own meal. "How," commented Candide, "can you expect me to eat ham when I've just killed the son of the Baron and find myself condemned thereby never to see the fair Kuniganda again in my life? What will it profit me to prolong my wretched existence when I'll have to spend my remaining days far away from her in remorse and despair?" But even as he spoke, Candide ate. The sun was setting when the two wanderers heard a few faint female cries. They did not know whether these cries were cries of pain or joy, but nonetheless they jumped up quickly, full of the anxiety and alarm that every sound inspires in an unknown country. In fact, these sounds were coming from two stark naked girls who were running lightly along the edge of the meadow, followed by two monkeys. At this sight, Candide took his double-barreled Spanish gun from his shoulder, fired, and killed the two monkeys. "God be praised, Cacambo. I've delivered those two ladies. If I committed a sin in killing an Inquisitor and a Jesuit, I've certainly made up for it by saving the lives of these two girls. Perhaps they are two young ladies of quality, and this adventure may earn us great advantages in this country." The two went into a wood, where they finished eating their supper, after which they fell asleep on some moss. When they woke up, they found they could not move. During the night, the natives of the country, known as Big Ears, to whom the two ladies had denounced them for killing their pets, had bound them with ropes of bark, and they were now surrounded by about 50 of the tribe, armed with bows and arrows, stone clubs, and hatchets. Some were boiling up a great cauldron, while others were preparing spits. They were all shouting, "It's a Jesuit! It's a Jesuit! We shall be avenged, and we shall have a good meal! Let's eat Jesuit! Let's eat Jesuit!" "I told you, dear master," said Cacambo bitterly. "I said those two girls would do us a bad turn." Candide, seeing the cauldron and the spits, remarked, "We are certain to be roasted or boiled. Ah, what would Dr. Pangloss say if he saw what the pure state of nature is like? But all is well. So be it." "Don't despair," Cacambo told the inconsolate Candide. "I understand a bit of these people's lingo, so I'm going to have a word with them." "Do not fail," said Candide, "to point out to them what a frightful inhumanity it is to cook people, and also how unchristian it is." "Gentlemen," began Cacambo, "I know you're counting on eating a Jesuit today, and that is a very good thing to do. In fact, natural law teaches us to kill our neighbor, and this is how people behave all over the world. If our race does not exercise our right to eat him, that's because we have other ingredients for a good meal. But, gentlemen, you don't want to eat your friends, do you? While you may think you're going to put a Jesuit on your spit, it is, in fact, the enemy of your enemies that you are about to roast. I myself was born in your country. The gentleman you see here is my master, and far from being a Jesuit, he has recently killed a Jesuit, and he is wearing his spoils, which is the reason for your mistake. To verify what I'm telling you, take his robe to the frontier and find out whether my master has not killed a Jesuit officer. It won't take you long, and I promise you that you can still eat us if you find that I've lied to you. But if I've told you the truth, you know the principles of international law too well not to spare us." The tribe found this speech very reasonable, so they deputized two notables to go and find out the truth. These two deputies soon returned, bearing good news. The tribesmen untied their two prisoners, paid them all sorts of compliments, offered them girls, gave them refreshments, and then escorted them all the way to the capital, shouting joyfully, "He's not a Jesuit! He's not a Jesuit!" Candide could never tire of wondering at this deliverance. "What a race," he said. "What men! What customs! If it were not for my good fortune in giving Mademoiselle Kuniganda's brother a great sword thrust through the body, I would surely have been eaten. So after all, nature is good." When they were at the edge of the tribe's territory, Cacambo said to Candide, "You see, this hemisphere is no better than the other. I recommend we return to Europe by the shortest route." "How can we go back?" asked Candide. "And where could we go? If I go back to my own country, the Bulgarians and Arbarians are slaughtering everyone. If I go back to Portugal, I will be burned. But if we stay in this country, we run the risk of being put on a spit at any moment. In any case, how can I leave Mademoiselle Kuniganda behind?" "Well, let's go towards Cayenne," replied Cacambo. "There we'll find Frenchmen. They go all over the world, and they'll help us. Perhaps with them, God will have pity on us." It was not easy to get to Cayenne, although they knew the direction. Mountains, rivers, precipices, brigands, and savages put up formidable obstacles to their journey. Their horses died of fatigue. Their provisions were used up, so that for a whole month they lived on wild fruits. But at last they found themselves by a river bordered with coconut trees. Here Cacambo advised Candide, "We're at the end of our tether. We've walked far enough. I can see an empty canoe on the bank, so let's fill it with coconuts, board it, and drift with the current, for a river always leads to an inhabited spot. Even if we do not find anything pleasant, at least we'll find something new." "Let's go," agreed Candide. "Let's surrender to Providence." So they drifted between the riverbanks, variously flowery, barren, smooth, and rugged. The river kept getting wider until finally it disappeared under an arch of massive rocks that rose up to the heavens. At this point, the river narrowed, carrying them along with terrific speed and noise. 24 hours later, they saw daylight again, although their canoe was smashed on the reefs. Candide and Cacambo had to drag themselves from rock to rock for a mile. Eventually, they looked down on an immense horizon bordered by inaccessible mountains. The country was cultivated for pleasure as well as for need. Everywhere, the useful was attractive. The roads were decorated with carriages, brilliant in form and material, bearing men and women of singular beauty, which were drawn with a swiftness which exceeded that of the finest horses. "Here is a country that is better than Westphalia," exclaimed Candide. With Cacambo following him, they set out for the nearest village. A few village children, covered with badly torn gold brocade, were playing quoits at the entrance to the village. Our two men watched them with enjoyment. Their quoits were rather wide, made of round pieces of yellow, green, and red stones, which shone with singular brilliance. The travelers picked up a few of them. They were gold, emeralds, and rubies, the least of which would have been the most treasured ornament on a Mogul's throne. "No doubt," commented Cacambo, "these children are the sons of the king of the country." The village schoolmaster appeared at that moment to call in the children. "That," said Candide, "is the tutor of the royal family. Look, the little beggars have left their quoits behind." Candide picked up the quoits and ran with them to the tutor. By way of signs, he made the tutor understand that their royal highnesses had forgotten their gold and precious stones. The village schoolmaster smiled, threw the quoits back onto the ground, then looked at Candide's face with much surprise. After a moment, he continued on his way. The travelers picked up the gold, the rubies, and the emeralds. "Where are we?" exclaimed Candide. "The king's children must be exceedingly well brought up in this country, since they are taught to despise gold and jewels." Cacambo was as surprised as Candide. They approached a house in the village, which was built like a European palace. A crowd was bustling at the door, and there were even more people inside, from which came the noise of pleasant music and a delicious odor of cooking. Cacambo approached and heard the people speaking Peruvian, which was his mother tongue. "I'll be your interpreter," he said to Candide. "Let's go in. This is a tavern." Instantly, 2 boys and 2 girls, dressed in cloth of gold, their hair bound with ribbons, invited them to sit at the host's table. They were served with excellent food and poured several liqueurs made of sugar cane. The guests were for the most part merchants and coachmen, all of the greatest politeness, who asked Cacambo many questions, using the utmost discretion, and who answered his in a most satisfactory manner. When the meal was over, Cacambo, like Candide, tried to pay the bill by throwing onto the host's table 2 of the gold pieces they had picked up. The host and hostess burst out laughing, and only after a while did they finally recover themselves. "Gentlemen," said the host, "we can see you are foreigners, although we're not accustomed to seeing any. Pardon us if we laughed when you offered us those pebbles in payment. No doubt you have none of our money, but it's not necessary to have any to dine here. All the hostelries have been established for the convenience of traders and are paid for by the government. You've had a poor meal here in comparison with some, for this is a poor village, but everywhere else you'll be received as you deserve to be." Cacambo explained all the host's remark to Candide, who listened to them with the same amazement and the same bewilderment with which his friend Cacambo reported them. "What kind of country is this, then?" they asked each other. "Unknown to the rest of the world, and where nature is of a sort so different from ours. This is the country where all is well, for there must be one of that sort." In response to Cacambo's curiosity, his host explained, "I'm not a learned man, but we have here with us an old man who has retired from the court. He is the most educated man in the whole kingdom, and also happens to be the most communicative." He took Cacambo and Candide to see this old man. They entered a simple house, for the floor was made only of silver, and the paneling in the apartment was made only of gold, but wrought with so much good taste that even the richest paneling would not eclipse it. True, the antechamber was encrusted with only rubies and emeralds, but the order in which everything was arranged made up for this extreme simplicity. The old man received the 2 foreigners on a sofa stuffed with hummingbirds' feathers, and then had them served drinks in diamond vases, after which he spoke at length. "I am 172 years old, and I learned from my late father, a query to the king, of the astounding revolutions in Peru that he had witnessed. The kingdom which we inhabit is the ancient homeland of the Incas, who left it very imprudently to go and subjugate part of the world, only to be finally destroyed by the Spaniards. The princes who remained in their native country were wiser. They ordered thereafter that no inhabitant could ever leave our little kingdom, and that has preserved our innocence and happiness ever since. The Spaniards gained some confused knowledge of this country which they called El Dorado. But since we are surrounded by inaccessible rock and precipices, we have, up to now, always been sheltered from the rapacity of the nations of Europe, who have an incomprehensible appetite for the pebbles and mud in our land, and who would kill every last man of us to get some." His ensuing monologue was long, covering as it did all the forms and customs of the country. Finally, Candide, who had always had a taste for metaphysics, had Cacambo ask whether there was a religion in El Dorado. The old man blushed. "What?" he exclaimed. "Can you not see it? Certainly we have a religion, as everyone has. We worship God from morning to evening. Do you worship only a single God? Asked Cacambo. It appears, replied the old man, there may be 1, 2, 3, or 4 gods. You ask very singular questions. Candide could not tire of having this good man questioned. He wanted to know how they prayed to God in El Dorado. We do not pray to him, said the sage. We have nothing to ask him for he has given us all we need. We merely thank him without ceasing. Candide was curious to see some priests, and he asked where they were. The good old man smiled. My friends, we are all priests. The king and all the heads of families sing hymns of thanksgiving every morning, and 5,000 or 6,000 musicians accompany them. What? You have no monks to teach, to govern, to intrigue, to dispute, and to have people burned who are not of their opinion? We would have to be crazy. We all hold the same opinion, so we do not understand what you need with your monks. Candide said to himself, This is very different indeed from Westphalia and the castle of my lord the Baron. If our friend Pangloss had seen El Dorado, he would no longer have said that the castle was the best thing on earth. Travel is certainly necessary. After their long conversation, the old man had a carriage harnessed with 6 sheep and gave the 2 travelers 12 of his servants to escort them to court. Please excuse me, he asked of them, since my age deprives me of the honor of accompanying you. However, the king will receive you in a way that will not leave you dissatisfied, and you will doubtless pardon the customs of the country if you find any that displease you. In less than 4 hours, Candide and Cacambo arrived at the king's palace, situated at one end of the capital. The entrance was 220 feet high and 100 feet wide. It is impossible to describe what material it was made of. 20 beautiful girls received Candide and Cacambo as they got out of the carriage, and took them to the baths and dressed them in robes woven from hummingbird down. After this, the men and women who were the grand officers of the crown took them to His Majesty's apartment, between 2 ranks of 1,000 musicians each. When they approached the throne room, Cacambo asked one grand officer how they should go about saluting His Majesty. The custom, replied the officer, is to embrace the king and kiss him on both cheeks. So Candide and Cacambo threw their arms around the neck of His Majesty, who received them with all the royal grace imaginable, and politely asked them to supper. While waiting, they were shown the town, the public buildings rising to the clouds, the marketplaces adorned with 1,000 columns, the fountains of pure water, together with those of rosewater and sugar-cane liqueurs, and the great squares paved with a precious stone which gave off a perfume like that of cloves and cinnamon. Candide asked to see the law courts. They told him that there were none, and that people never went to law. He then inquired whether there were any prisoners, and they told him no. What surprised him even more, and pleased him most, was the Palace of Sciences, in which he saw a great gallery 2,000 paces long, full of instruments for physics and mathematics. After spending all the afternoon touring about only 1,000th part of the city, they were taken back to the king's palace. Candide sat down at table with His Majesty, his valet, and several ladies. Never was better cheer made, and never had a man more wit at supper than His Majesty. Cacambo explained the king's witty remarks to Candide, and even when translated, they still appeared witty. They stayed a month in this hospitable place. During this time, Candide never tired of saying to Cacambo, "It's true, my friend, that the castle in which I was born was not nearly as good as this. But despite that, Mademoiselle Kuniganda is not here, and no doubt you also have a mistress in Europe. If we stay here, we shall only be like the others. Whereas if we return to our own world with just 12 sheep laden with the pebbles of El Dorado, we shall be richer than all our lords put together. We shall have no more inquisitors to fear, and we shall easily be able to rescue Mademoiselle Kuniganda." Cacambo liked this idea, so these two happy men decided to ask His Majesty for leave to go. "You're doing a foolish thing," replied the king. "I know my country is not much, but when a person is reasonably well off somewhere, he should stay there. Certainly I have no right to detain foreigners, since all men are free. Leave when you wish, but the way out is very difficult, for it's impossible to return by the river by which you miraculously came here, and the mountains that surround the kingdom are more than 10 miles wide, and you can only descend them by way of precipices. However, since you absolutely want to leave, I'm going to give orders to the director of machinery to make you a machine that can transport you comfortably. When you have been taken to the other side of the mountains, no one will be able to take you any further, for my subjects have made a vow never to go beyond the mountains, and they are too wise to break their vow. Ask anything else of me you like." "We ask," replied Cacambo, "only for a few sheep loaded with supplies, pebbles, and some of the country's mud." The king laughed and said, "I do not understand your people's taste for our yellow mud, but take as much of it as you want, and much good may it do you." He immediately gave orders to have his engineers make a machine to hoist Candide and Cacambo out of the kingdom. 3,000 good physicists worked on it. The machine was ready in 2 weeks, and cost no more than 20 million pounds sterling in the money of that country. They put Candide and Cacambo into the machine, together with the sheep to serve them as mounts once they had crossed the mountains. There were 20 sheep laden with supplies, another 30 bearing curious presents from the country, and finally 50 laden with gold, precious stones, and diamonds. The king embraced the two wanderers tenderly. Their departure was a fine spectacle. As promised, the physicists took leave of them after setting them down safely on the other side of the mountains, and Candide had no other desire than to present his sheep to Mademoiselle Kuniganda. "We have enough gold to pay the governor of Buenos Aires if Mademoiselle Kuniganda is to be ransomed. Then let's head for Cayenne and see what kingdom we can buy," Candide remarked. Our two travelers' first day outside El Dorado was rather pleasant. They were encouraged by finding themselves possessors of greater treasure than all Asia, Europe, and Africa could together assemble. Candide, infatuated, wrote Kuniganda's name on many trees. On the second day, 2 of their sheep got stuck in the marshes and went down with their loads. 2 other sheep died of fatigue 2 days later. 7 or 8 of them died of hunger in the desert, and a few days later, others fell from precipices. Finally, after 100 days of travel, they had only 2 sheep left. Candide said to Cacambo, "My friend, you see how perishable are the riches of this world. Only virtue is solid, and only my happiness at seeing Mademoiselle Kuniganda again is certain." "I agree," said Cacambo, "but we still have 2 sheep left carrying more treasure than the King of Spain will ever have. In the distance I see a town that I suspect is Surinam, which belongs to the Dutch. Now, we're at the end of our troubles and the beginning of our happiness." As they approached the town, they met a Negro stretched out on the ground, wearing only a pair of blue cloth shorts. The poor man had his left leg and his right hand missing. "Good Lord!" cried Candide to him in Dutch. "What are you doing there, my friend, in that awful state?" "I'm waiting for my master, Monsieur Van der Dende, the famous merchant," the Negro replied.
Was it Monsieur Van der Dende who treated you this way?"
"Yes, sir. It's the custom. They give us a pair of shorts twice a year for our clothing. We work in the sugar mills and catch our fingers in the millstone, so they cut off our hand. When we try to run away, they cut off our legs. Both these things have happened to me. This is the price to be paid so that you can eat sugar in Europe. However, when my mother sold me for 10 silver coins on the Guinea coast, she said to me, 'My dear child, bless our fetishes and worship them always, for they will make your life happy. You are honored in being a slave to our lords the whites, and thereby you are making a fortune for your father and mother.' Alas, I don't know whether I made their fortune, but they certainly didn't make mine. The Dutch fetishes who converted me tell me every Sunday that all of us, whites and blacks, are children of Adam. I am no genealogist, but if those preachers are telling the truth, we're all second cousins. You must admit that no one could treat their relatives in a more horrible way."
"Oh, Pangloss," exclaimed Candide, "you hadn't even guessed at this abomination. This does it. I shall have to renounce your optimism."
"What's optimism?" asked Cacambo.
Candide explained. "It's the mania for maintaining that all is well when we're miserable." The first thing they inquired about when they entered Surinam was whether there was a ship that was going to Buenos Aires. The man they spoke to proved to be a Spanish ship's captain, who offered to make a bargain with them at an inn. Candide and the honest Cacambo went and met him there with their 2 sheep. Candide told the Spaniard all about his adventures, and admitted to him that he wanted to free Mademoiselle Kuniganda.
"I'll take good care not to take you to Buenos Aires," replied the captain, "for I would be hanged, and so would you. Don't you know that your fair Kuniganda is the governor's favorite mistress?"
This was a bolt from the blue for Candide, over which he wept for a long time. Finally, he took Cacambo aside. "My dear friend," he said to him, "here is what we must do. We each have in our pockets 5 or 6 millions worth of diamonds. You are cleverer than I am. Go to get Mademoiselle Kuniganda in Buenos Aires. If the governor causes any problems, give him 1 million. If he still doesn't give in, give him 2. Since you haven't killed any inquisitor, they won't suspect you. Meanwhile, I will fit out another ship and go to Venice, where I'll wait for you. Venice is a free country where there's nothing to fear from Bulgarians, Barbarians, Jews, or inquisitors." Cacambo was in despair at parting with such a good master, who had become his intimate friend. But the pleasure of being useful to him overcame this grief. They embraced, shedding tears at their separation. Candide advised Cacambo not to forget the good old woman. The valet left that very day. He was a good man, this Cacambo. Candide stayed on some time in Surinam, and waited for another captain willing to take him to Italy, together with the 2 sheep he had left. He hired servants, and brought everything he needed for the long voyage ahead. At last, the merchant Van der Dende, master of a big ship, came to see him. "How much do you want," Candide asked this man, "to take me straight to Venice?" The captain proposed a price of 10,000 pesos, at which Candide did not hesitate. "So," said the prudent merchant to himself, "this foreigner hands over 10,000 pesos straight away. He must be very rich." Then, returning a moment later, he explained that due to unforeseen difficulties, the captain would not sail for less than 20,000. "Very well, you shall have them," agreed Candide. "Phew," said the merchant to himself. "This man can give 20,000 as easily as 10. He turned back to Candide and said that, after all, he could not take him for less than 30,000. Again Candide agreed. "Oh," said the Dutch merchant to himself, 30,000 obviously means nothing to this man. No doubt these 2 sheep of his are carrying immense treasures. but I'll not insist any further at the moment. I'll take the 30,000 now, and then we'll see."
Candide sold 2 little diamonds, the smaller of which was worth more than the entire sum the merchant had demanded, and paid in advance. The 2 sheep were put on board the ship, while Candide followed in a little boat which was going to join the ship in the channel. The captain seized his chance, set sail, weighed anchor, and with the wind in his favour, sailed off. Candide, bewildered and stupefied, soon lost sight of him. "Alas!" he cried, "that's a trick worthy of the old world." He returned to the shore sunk in grief, for he'd lost enough to make the fortune of 20 monarchs. He went to see the Dutch judge, and since he was somewhat upset, he knocked roughly on the door. He went in, explained his loss, speaking a little louder than was reasonable. The judge began by making him pay a fine of 10,000 pesos for the noise he had made. Then he listened to him patiently, promising to look into the affair as soon as the merchant had returned. Then he charged Candide a further 10,000 pesos for the hearing. This completed Candide's despair. True, he had already endured misfortunes 1,000 times more painful, but the cold-bloodedness of the judge and of the merchant who had robbed him inflamed his passion and plunged him into a black depression. When Candide discovered a French ship was leaving for Bordeaux, he hired a cabin at the normal price, since he had no more sheep laden with diamonds to put on board, and let it be known in town that he would pay for any decent man who would like to make the voyage with him, on condition that he should be the most unfortunate man in the province. Such a throng of aspirants presented themselves that a fleet could not have held them all. Candide, wanting to choose the most promising, picked out about 20 persons, who seemed to him sociable enough, and who all claimed to be the most deserving of the offer. He assembled them in an inn, and gave them supper on condition that each would take an oath to tell their story faithfully. The session lasted until 4 in the morning. Candide, as he listened to all their adventures, remembered what the old woman had said to him on the way to Buenos Aires, and the wager she had made that there was no one on the ship to whom very great misfortune had not happened. With each adventure related, he also thought of Pangloss. "From what I am hearing," he thought, "Pangloss would have great difficulty in trying to prove his system. I wish he were here. Certainly, if all is well, it can only be in El Dorado, and not in the rest of the world." Finally, he made up his mind in favor of a poor scholar who had worked 10 years for booksellers in Amsterdam, and who maintained that there was no more disgusting occupation in the world. This scholar, moreover, was a good man, who had been robbed by his wife, beaten by his son, and abandoned by his daughter, who had eloped with a Portuguese. He had just been thrown out of a job on which his livelihood depended, and the preachers of Surinam were persecuting him because they took him for a rationalist. It must be admitted that others were at least as unfortunate as he, but Candide hoped that the scholar would ease his boredom during the voyage. All the scholar's rivals considered that Candide was doing them a great injustice, but he appeased them by giving them each 100 pesos. So the old scholar, whose name was Martin, embarked with Candide for Bordeaux. Both had seen much and suffered much, and if the ship had been scheduled to sail from Surinam to Japan by the Cape of Good Hope, they would have had enough to say about moral and physical evil to last the whole voyage. However, Candide had one great advantage over Martin. He still hoped to see Mademoiselle Kuniganda again, and Martin had nothing to hope for. Furthermore, Candide still had gold and diamonds. Even though he had lost 100 big sheep, laden with the greatest treasures on earth, when he thought about what he had left in his pockets, and when he talked about Kuniganda, especially towards the end of a meal, Candide still tended to favor Pangloss's system. "But you, Martin," he asked the scholar, "what do you think of things? What is your view of moral and physical evil?" "Sir," replied Martin, "priests accuse me of being a rationalist, but the truth is that I'm a Manichaean, and believe in 2 almost equal forces of good and evil." "You're making fun of me," replied Candide. "There are no Manichaeans in the world."
There's me, contended Martin, though I don't know what to do about it. But I can't think any other way. You must be full of the devil, commented Candide. Since he takes so much interest in the affairs of the world, said Martin, I might just as well be full of him. I must admit that when I look over this globe, I think that God has abandoned it to some evil being, except for El Dorado, of course. I have hardly seen a town that did not want to ruin its neighbor, never a family that did not want to exterminate some other family. Everywhere the weak loathe the powerful, and the powerful treat the weak like animals whose flesh is for sale. 1,000,000 regimented assassins, ranging from one end of Europe to the other, practice murder to earn their bread because there's no more honest occupation. Even in the towns that seem to enjoy peace and where the arts flourish, men are devoured with more envy, cares, and anxieties than the scourges suffered by the towns besieged. I think secret griefs are more cruel than public miseries. In short, I've seen so much and suffered so much that I'm a Manichaean. Yet there is some good to be found, contested Candide. That may be so, agreed Martin, but if there is, I've never seen it. In the middle of this dispute, they heard the sound of cannon. The noise increased so that everyone took out their telescopes, through which they saw 2 ships fighting about 3 miles away. The wind brought them so near the French ship that they had the pleasure of seeing the combat quite at their ease. Finally, one of the 2 ships sent the other a broadside so low and so accurate that it sank. Candide and Martin saw 100 men on the main deck of the sinking ship who raised their hands to heaven and uttered frightful screams. In an instant, everything was swallowed up by the sea. Well, said Martin, that's how men treat each other. It's true, agreed Candide. There's something diabolical about. So saying, he noticed something bright red swimming near his ship. The sailors launched the ship's boat to see what it could be. It was one of Candide's sheep. Candide felt more joy on finding this sheep again than he had felt grief on losing the 100 laden with big diamonds in El Dorado. The French captain soon discovered that the captain of the ship that had sunk the merchant vessel was a Spaniard, and that indeed it was the Dutch merchant who had robbed Candide together with the precious cargo which had been swallowed by the sea, and that the red sheep was all that had been saved. You can see from this episode, explained Candide to Martin, that crime is sometimes punished. That rascal of a Dutch merchant and his captain met the fate they deserved. Yes, replied Martin, but was it necessary that the passengers on his ship should also perish? God punished the wrongdoers, but the devil drowned the others. Candide continued his conversations with Martin. They argued for 2 weeks without stopping, and after 2 weeks were no more advanced than they had been on the very first day. But all the time they were talking, they were exchanging ideas and consoling each other. Candide kept stroking his sheep. I've a feeling that now I've found you again, he told it, I may well find Kuniganda once more. Have you ever been to France before, Martin? Asked Candide. Yes, replied Martin. I've travelled through several of its provinces. In some, half the inhabitants are crazy, while in others they're too clever by half. In some they are rather gentle and stupid, while in others they try to be witty. But in all of them, the principal occupation is making love. The second is talking slander, and the third talking nonsense. Martin, have you ever seen Paris? Yes, I've seen Paris, but it's like all the other cities. It's chaos, a crowd in which everyone seeks pleasure and in which almost no one finds it. I didn't stay there long. On arrival, I was robbed of all I had by pickpockets at the Saint-Germain fair. I was taken for a thief myself and was imprisoned for a week. After which, I became a printer's proofreader to earn enough to return to Holland. I came to know the writing rabble and the religious maniacs. I have not the slightest curiosity to see France, announced Candide. As you can guess, when a man has spent a month in El Dorado, he does not care about seeing anything else, except Mademoiselle Kuniganda. I'm going to wait for her in Venice, but we'll cross France on our way to Italy. Will you come along with me? Gladly, replied Martin. They say that Venice is good only for Venetian nobles, but I hear that they receive foreigners very well, although only when they have a lot of money. I, of course, have none, but you have, and so I will follow you anywhere. Oh, by the way, said Candide, apropos of nothing, do you think that the earth was originally a sea, as it says in that big book the ship's captain has? I believe nothing of the sort, responded Martin. At least, no more than any of the other daydreams people have been trying to sell. But then, why was this world formed? Asked Candide. To drive us mad, replied Martin. Do you think, asked Candide, that men have always massacred each other, and have always been liars, cheats, faithless, ingrates, brigands, weaklings, cowards, enviers, gluttons, drunkards, misers, self-seekers, carnivores, calumniators, debauchees, fanatics, hypocrites, and fools? Do you think that sparrowhawks have always eaten pigeons? Yes, no doubt, replied Candide. Well then, said Martin, if sparrowhawks have always had the same character, why do you expect men to have changed theirs? But there's a great difference, said Candide, for free will... Reasoning thus, the pair arrived at Bordeaux. Candide stayed in Bordeaux only as long as it took to sell a few of his pebbles from El Dorado, and to provide himself with a good two-seater chaise, for now he could not do without his philosopher Martin, but he was sorry to part with his sheep, which he left to the Bordeaux Academy of Science, which proposed to find out why this sheep's wool was red. All the travellers that Candide met in the inns on the roads said to him, "We're going to Paris." This general eagerness finally gave Candide a hankering to see the place himself. He entered the city via the grim suburb of the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, which he compared unfavourably with the ugliest village in Westphalia. Hardly was Candide settled at an inn than he was attacked by an illness caused by his fatigue. Since he had an enormous diamond ring on his finger, and a prodigiously heavy strong-box had been observed as his baggage, he immediately had at his side 2 doctors whom he had not called, some really intimate new friends who would not leave him, and 2 pious ladies who heated up his broth. Martin said, "I remember being sick in Paris on my first trip. I was very poor, so I had neither friends nor pious ladies nor doctors, and I still got well." However, by dint of bloodletting and medicine, Candide's illness became serious. The neighborhood priest came and asked him gently for a note payable to the bearer in the next world. Candide wanted no part of it, but the pious ladies assured him that it was a new fashion, to which Candide replied that he was not a man of fashion. Martin wanted to throw the priest out of the window. In retaliation, the cleric swore that Candide would not be buried in consecrated ground. Martin in turn swore that he would bury the cleric if he continued to bother them. The quarrel grew heated. Martin took the priest by the shoulders and pushed him out roughly, which caused a great scandal and which led, in turn, to a legal report. Candide got well, and during his convalescence he had very good company to supper with him. They gambled for high stakes, although Candide was constantly amazed that he never got any aces, while Martin was not at all amazed at this. Among those who did the honors was a little abbé from Périgord, one of those eager, alert people, always obliging, brazen, fawning, complaisant, who lie in wait for strangers passing through to tell them the history of the town's scandals and offer them pleasures at any price. This man first took Martin and Candide to the theatre, where they saw a new tragedy. Candide found himself seated next to some wits, but this did not prevent him from weeping at some perfectly played scenes. One of these reasoners criticized him during the intermission. "You're very wrong to weep, for that actress is very bad. The actor playing opposite her even worse, and the play itself is even worse than the actors. The author doesn't know a word of Arabic, and yet the scene is in Arabia. Tomorrow I will bring you 20 pamphlets condemning him." "Sir, how many plays have you seen in France?" asked Candide of the Abbé, who replied, 5,000 or 6,000. "That's a lot. How many of them have been good?" 15 or 16. "That's a lot," commented Martin dryly. Candide was very taken with an actress who played Queen Elizabeth in a rather dull tragedy. "I like that actress very much," he announced to Martin, "for she reminds me of Mademoiselle Kuniganda. I'd very much like to pay her my respects." The Abbé offered to take him to meet her. Candide, brought up in Germany, asked what the proper etiquette was and how to treat queens of England in France. "You have to make a distinction," said the Abbé, "for in the provinces they take them to a tavern, while in Paris they only respect them when they are beautiful and throw them on the dump when they are dead." "Queens on the dump?" exclaimed Candide. "Yes," commented Martin. "The Abbé is right, for I was in Paris when Mademoiselle Conimet, the distinguished actress, passed on, as they say. She was refused the honors of burial, that is to say, of rotting with all the beggars of the district in an ugly cemetery. Alone of all her troupe, she was buried at the corner of the Rue de Bourgogne, which must have pained her extremely, for she had a very noble mind." "That was very improper," remarked Candide. "What do you expect?" said Martin. "These people are made that way. Imagine all possible contradictions and incompatibilities, and you will see them in the government, the tribunals, the churches, and in the entertainments of this queer nation." "And is it true that people are always laughing in Paris?" asked Candide. "Yes," replied the Abbé, "but it is with rage in their hearts. For here people complain about everything with great bursts of laughter, and they even perform the most detestable actions with a laugh. Who was that fat pig who was telling me so many bad things about the play at which I wept, and about the actors who gave me so much pleasure?" "He's a living disease," replied the Abbé. "He makes his living by saying bad things about plays and books. He hates anyone who succeeds, as eunuchs hate those who enjoy sex. He's a serpent of literature, feeding on filth and venom. He's a foliferous pamphleteer." "What do you mean, a foliferous pamphleteer?" asked Candide. "A producer of scribbled leaves," explained the Abbé. "Although I am very eager to see Mademoiselle Kuniganda again," mused Candide, "I would still like to have supper with the actress, Mademoiselle Clairon." The Abbé was not the man to approach Mademoiselle Clairon, for she only saw good company. "Although she's engaged this evening," explained the Abbé, "I'll take you instead to the house of a lady of quality, and there you'll come to know Paris, as if you had been here for years." Candide, who was naturally curious, let himself be taken to the lady's house, at the far end of the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, the aristocratic quarter of the city. There people were busy playing faro. 12 sad punters each held a small hand of cards, the foolish register of their misfortunes. A deep silence reigned. The punters' foreheads were pallid, the bankers anxious. The lady of the house, seated beside this pitiless banker, watched with a lynx's eyes all the underhand plays. But she did not show any anger at these illegal moves, for fear of losing her customers. The lady called herself the Marquise de Parolignac. Her daughter, aged 15, was one of the punters, and tipped her off with a wink to indicate those who were cheating and trying to make good the cruelties of fortune. When the Abbé, Martin, and Candide entered, no one got up, greeted them, or looked at them. They were too deeply preoccupied with their cards. My lady the Baroness of Tunda ten Trunk was more civil than this, commented Candide. However, the abbé got the ear of the Marquise, who half rose, honouring Candide with a gracious smile, and Martin with a truly noble nod. She saw to it that a seat and a hand of cards was given to Candide, who lost 50,000 francs in only 2 deals. After which they had a supper in a most agreeable mood. Everyone was astounded that Candide was not upset by his loss. The supper was like most suppers in Paris. First a silence, then a noise consisting of indistinguishable words, then jokes, most of them mediocre, false news, bad reasoning, a little politics, and a lot of slander. There was even some talk about new books. Candide listened attentively to a long speech by one of the guests on the subject of tragedy, and formed a detailed impression of the speaker. Since the Marquise had taken care to place him next to her, he got her ear, and took the liberty of asking her who the man who spoke so well was. "He is a learned gentleman," replied the lady, "who does not play cards much, and whom the abbé sometimes brings to supper. He is a perfect connoisseur of tragedies and books, has himself written a tragedy that was hissed, and a book of which only one copy, which he dedicated to me, was ever seen outside the publisher's store." "What a great man!" exclaimed Candide. "He's another Pangloss." Then, turning towards the man, he said, "Sir, no doubt you think that all is for the best in the world, and that nothing could have been otherwise." "I, sir," replied the scholar, "think nothing of the sort. Rather I think that everything goes wrong, that no one knows his rank or his job, or what he is doing, or what he should do, and that except for supper, which is rather jolly, and where there seems to be a good deal of agreement, all the rest of one's time is spent in senseless quarrels. Ascetics rage against believers over predestination, lawyers against churchmen, men of letters against men of letters, courtiers against courtiers, financiers against people, wives against husbands, relatives against relatives. We are all of us in a state of constant war." Candide replied, "But I've seen worse. A sage who had the misfortune to be hanged taught me that everything was wonderful, and all these things you speak of are but the shadows in a wonderful picture." "Your hanged man was making fun of everybody," said Martin, "for your shadows are in truth horrible stains." Meanwhile, most of the gamblers, who understood nothing of this talk, were drinking. As Martin continued to talk theory with the scholar, Candide told the lady of the house about his adventures. After supper, the Marquise took Candide into her boudoir, and sat him down on a sofa. "Well," she said to him, "so you're still madly in love with Mademoiselle Kuniganda?" "Yes, madam," replied Candide truthfully. "You answer me like a young man from Westphalia. A Frenchman would have said to me, 'It's true that I have been in love with Mademoiselle Kuniganda, but when I see you, madam, I can no longer love her.'" "Alas, madam." "You say that your passion for her began when you picked up her handkerchief. But I want you to pick up my garter." "With all my heart," replied Candide, and he picked it up. "Now I want you to put it back on me." Candide obliged her. "You see, you're a foreigner. Sometimes I make my Parisian lovers languish for 2 weeks. But I'm giving myself to you on the very first night because one must do the honors to a young man from Westphalia." This beauty, having espied the 2 enormous diamonds on her young foreigner's hands, praised them so sincerely that they passed from Candide's fingers to her own. When Candide went home with the abbé, he felt some remorse at having been unfaithful to Mademoiselle Kuniganda. The abbé shared his grief, for he had got only a small share in the 50,000 francs that Candide had gambled away. His plan was to make all the profit he could with which his acquaintance with Candide might provide him. He talked a lot about Kuniganda, and Candide told him he would certainly beg the young lady's pardon for his infidelity when he met her in Venice. The Perigordian redoubled his courtesies and attentions, and took a tender interest in everything Candide said, everything he did, everything he wanted to do. "I suppose," observed the Abbé, "that Mademoiselle Kuniganda has a great deal of wit, and writes charming letters." "I've never received any from her," said Candide. "You see, having been expelled from the castle for love of her, I was unable to write to her, and soon afterwards I learned that she was dead. Then I found her again, and now I've lost her. I've sent her a dispatch by special messenger, who's more than 2,500 miles away, and I'm still awaiting her reply." The Abbé listened attentively, and became thoughtful. He soon took leave of the two foreigners, after embracing them tenderly. The next day, Candide, on waking, received a letter. "My very dear lover, I've been ill in this city for a week, but I've just learned that you are here. I would fly to your arms if I could but move. I heard that you had passed through Bordeaux, and so I've left the faithful Cacambo and the old woman there, and they are to follow me soon. The governor of Buenos Aires took everything from me, but I still have your heart. Come, your presence will restore me to life, or make me die of pleasure." This charming letter, this unhoped-for missive, gave Candide inexpressible joy. His dear Kuniganda's illness overwhelmed him with grief. Torn between these two feelings, he took his gold and diamonds, and was driven with Martin to the hotel where Mademoiselle Kuniganda was said to be staying. Candide entered, trembling with emotion, his heart beating, sobbing. He tried to open the curtains around her bed, asking for a light to be brought. "I'll do nothing of the sort," replied the maid, "for the light will be the death of her." She promptly closed the curtains again. "My dear Kuniganda," sobbed Candide, "how are you feeling? If you cannot see me, at least speak to me." "You're right, she can't see you," said the maid. The invalid then stretched out a plump hand, which Candide watered with tears, and which he then filled with diamonds, as well as leaving a bag of gold on the armchair. In the middle of these transports, a police officer arrived, followed by the Abbé. "So these are the two suspicious foreigners?" he asked. Immediately, Candide and Martin were arrested, and began to be dragged off to prison. "This is not how they treat travelers in El Dorado," shouted Candide. "I am more a Manichean than ever," groaned Martin. "But, sir, where are you taking us?" asked Candide. "To a deep dungeon," came the reply. Martin, having regained his coolness, decided that the lady claiming to be Kuniganda was a fraud who had taken advantage of Candide's innocence. Furthermore, he decided that the police officer was another fraud whom they could easily be rid of. Rather than expose himself to judicial procedure, Candide, enlightened by Martin's advice and impatient to see the real Mademoiselle Kuniganda, made the police officer an offer of 3 little diamonds worth about 3,000 pesos each. "Ah, sir," the man with the ivory baton smiled, "even if you'd committed every crime imaginable, you're the finest man in the world. 3 diamonds, worth 3,000 pesos each. Sir, I'd let myself be killed for you, rather than taking you down to the dungeon. They arrest all foreigners here, but let me take care of things. I've a brother in Dieppe, in Normandy. I'll take you to him, and if you have an extra diamond to give him, he'll take care of you." Immediately the policeman ordered the chains to be taken off his prisoners, saying he had made a mistake. His men were sent away. He then escorted Candide and Martin to Dieppe, and left them in his brother's hands. There was a little Dutch ship in the Narrows, on which the Norman, having, with the help of 3 diamonds, become the most obliging of men, booked passage for Candide. The ship was about to set out for Venice. 2 days later the captain was ready, and they set sail along the coast of France. They passed within sight of Lisbon, at which Candide shuddered. And finally they landed in Venice. "God be praised!" exclaimed Candide, embracing Martin. Here is where I shall see the fair Kuniganda again. I'm counting on Cacambo. All is well. All goes well as it possibly could. As soon as Candide arrived in Venice, he had a search made for Cacambo in all the taverns, all the cafes, and among all the ladies of pleasure, but did not find him. Every day he sent a man out to investigate all the incoming ships and boats, but there was no news of Cacambo. I've had time to cross from Surinam to Bordeaux, Bordeaux to Paris, Paris to Dieppe, to skirt the coasts of Portugal and Spain, to cross the whole Mediterranean, to spend a few months in Venice, and still the fair Kuniganda has not arrived here. Instead of her, I've only met a tricky wench and an abbé from Périgord. Kuniganda is without doubt dead, so there's nothing left for me to do but die. It would have been better to have remained in El Dorado than to return to this accursed Europe. How right you are, my dear Martin. Everything an illusion. Total disaster. Having confessed his feelings, Candide fell into a deep depression and took no part in the opera or other diversions of the carnival. Not a single lady caused him the least temptation. At last, Martin said to him, "Truly, you must be very simple to imagine that a half-breed valet who has 5 or 6 millions in his pocket will go off to find your mistress at one end of the world and bring her to you in the other. He'll take her for himself if he finds her. If he doesn't find her, he'll take another. I'd advise you to forget about Cacambo and Kuniganda." At this, Candide's melancholy merely increased, and Martin never stopped proving to him that there was little virtue and little happiness on earth, except perhaps in El Dorado, where no one could go anyway. While arguing about this important matter and waiting for Kuniganda, Candide noticed a young Theatine monk in the Piazza San Marco, arm in arm with a girl. The monk looked fresh, plump, and vigorous. His eyes were brilliant, his manner assured, his head upright, and his bearing proud. The girl was very pretty, and was singing. She looked lovingly at her Theatine, and from time to time pinched his plump cheeks. "You'll at least admit to me," said Candide to Martin, "that those people are happy. Up to now I've found, in all the habitable earth, except El Dorado, nothing but unfortunates. But as for that girl and that monk, I wager they are very happy creatures." "I wager they're not," retorted Martin. "We have only to ask them to dinner, and you'll see whether I'm wrong." Immediately Candide accosted them, paying them his compliments, and inviting them to come to his inn and eat macaroni, Lombardy partridges, and caviar. The lady blushed when the monk accepted the invitation, and the girl followed him, looking at Candide with eyes full of surprise and confusion, dimmed with a few tears. Hardly had she entered Candide's room than she said to him, "Does Monsieur Candide no longer recognize Paquette?" At these words Candide, who had not been looking at her with any attention until then, because he was preoccupied only with thoughts of Kuniganda, said to her, "Alas, my poor child, so it was you who put Dr. Pangloss in the fine state in which I saw him." "Alas, sir, it was me," confirmed Paquette. "I see that you know everything. I've heard about the frightful misfortunes that happened to the whole household, but I swear to you that my own destiny has been hardly less sad. I was very innocent when you knew me. The Franciscan who was my confessor easily seduced me. The consequences were frightful, and I was obliged to leave the castle soon after the Baron had sent you away. If a famous doctor had not taken pity on me, I would have died. For some time afterwards, I was that doctor's mistress. His wife, who was madly jealous, used to beat me pitilessly every day. I admit that the doctor was the ugliest of men, and I the unhappiest of all creatures, being beaten continually because of a man I did not love. Outraged at his wife's ways, the doctor gave her a medicine to cure her of a little cold. It was so efficacious that she died in terrible convulsions 2 hours later. relatives brought criminal charges against the good doctor, so he took flight, and I was put in prison. My innocence would not have saved me if I had not been rather pretty. The judge let me go on condition that he could succeed the doctor, but I was soon supplanted by a rival and tossed out without compensation, obliged to continue with an occupation that seems so attractive to you men. For us, it's an abyss of misery. So here I am, in Venice, practicing my calling. Sir, if you could imagine what it is to be obliged to caress an old merchant, a lawyer, a monk, a gondolier, or an abbé, to be exposed to every insult and outrage, to be reduced to borrowing a skirt only to have it lifted by some disgusting man, to be robbed by one man of what you earn from another, to be forced by the officers of the law to buy protection, and to have nothing to look forward to but a frightful old age in a hospital and on a dunghill. I am one of the unhappiest creatures in the world." Thus Paquette opened her heart to the good Candide in Martin's presence. The latter grinned at Candide on the conclusion of her story. "You see, I've already won half my wager." Meanwhile, Friar Giroflee had remained in the dining-room and was having a drink while waiting for dinner. "But," said Candide to Paquette, "you looked so happy, so jolly when I met you. You were singing, you were caressing the monk completely naturally. You seemed to me to be as happy as you claim to be unfortunate." "Ah, sir," replied Paquette, "that's another of the miseries of my trade. Yesterday I was robbed and beaten by an officer, and today I have to appear to be in a good mood to please a monk." Candide had had enough. He agreed Martin was right. They sat down at table with Paquette and the monk. The meal was entertaining, and towards the end they talked to each other with some frankness. "Father," remarked Candide to the monk, "you seem to me to enjoy a destiny that everyone must envy. The glow of good health shines from your face. Your physiognomy speaks of happiness. You have a very pretty girl for your recreation, and you seem very content with your condition as a monk." "Faith, sir," replied Friar Giroflee, "I wish all Theatines were at the bottom of the sea. I've been tempted 100 times to set fire to the monastery and then turn Turk. My parents forced me to put on this detestable robe at the age of 15, in order to leave a greater fortune to an older brother, whom I hope God confounds. Jealousy, discord, and rage inhabit the monastery. True, I have preached a few bad sermons that have brought me a little money, but half of which the prior steals from me. The rest allows me to keep girls. But when I go back to the monastery in the evening, I'm ready to smash my head against the dormitory walls. My colleagues are in exactly the same state." Martin, turning to Candide with his customary coolness, said to him, "Well, I do believe I've won our wager." Candide gave 2,000 pesos to Paquette and 1,000 pesos to Friar Giroflee. "I'm certain you'll be happy with this." "I don't believe that in the slightest," said Martin. "Indeed, by giving them those pesos, you'll make them unhappier yet." "That may be," replied Candide, "but at least one thing consoles me. I observe that we often find people again whom we never thought to find. Having met with my red sheep and Paquette again, I'm sure I shall also meet Kuniganda." "I hope," said Martin, "that she may some day be the making of your happiness, but that is something I strongly doubt." "You are a very hard man," objected Candide. "That's because I've lived," replied Martin. "But look at those gondoliers," said Candide. "Aren't they always singing? You don't see them at home with their wives and their children. The Doge has his troubles, and so do these gondoliers. It's true that, taken all in all, the lot of a gondolier is preferable to that of a Doge, but I think the difference is so slight that it's not worth examining. I've heard of a scholar, procurante, who lives in that handsome palace on the Brenta, and who receives foreigners well. They claim he's a man who has never known grief, countered Candide. I'd like to see so rare a species, commented Martin. Candide immediately sent to ask the procurante for permission to pay him a visit the next day. But during their visit, Candide was very distressed by the rich procurante's disparaging remarks about his wonderful works of art, his beautiful garden, the music he was played, and finally about a whole range of the finest literature, including Milton and Homer. For while Candide had no opinion of his own on almost all of these matters, he respected Homer, and rather liked Milton. "Alas," he whispered to Martin, "I'm very much afraid this man may have a sovereign contempt for our German poets." "There would be no harm in that," replied Martin. "Oh, what a superior man!" Candide exclaimed under his breath. "What a genius this procurante is! Nothing can please him." When the two sightseers had taken leave of His Excellency, Candide commented to Martin, "Well, you will agree that there is the happiest of men. He's above everything he possesses." "Don't you see that he's disgusted with everything he possesses?" "But," said Candide, "doesn't he obtain his pleasure in criticizing everything, in seeing defects where other men see only beauty?" "You mean to say," retorted Martin, "that there's pleasure in taking no pleasure." "Well," agreed Candide, "if that's the case, there is no one happier than I." However, their days and weeks in Venice passed by. Cacambo still did not return, and Candide was so depressed that he did not even notice that Paquette and the friar had not so much as come to thank him. One evening, Candide and Martin were going to dinner with some foreigners who were staying in the same hotel, when a man with a soot-colored face came up to Candide from behind, and taking him by the arm said, "Be ready to leave with us. Do not fail." Turning round, Candide saw Cacambo. Only the sight of Kuniganda could have astounded and pleased him more. He was on the point of going mad with joy, and warmly embraced his dear friend. "Then surely Kuniganda is here. Take me to her. Let me have the joy of seeing her." "Kuniganda is not here," replied Cacambo. "She's in Constantinople." "Heavens! In Constantinople? But even if she were in China, I'd hurry to her. Let's go." "We'll leave after supper," insisted Cacambo. "I can't tell you any more, for I'm now a slave, and my master is waiting for me. I must go and serve him at table. Don't say a word. Have supper, and be ready to go." Candide was torn between sorrow and joy, charmed to see his faithful agent again, but astounded to hear he was a slave. Full of the idea of recovering his mistress, his heart agitated and his mind topsy-turvy, Candide sat down to supper with Martin and with the 6 foreigners who had come for the carnival. Cacambo, who was pouring drinks for one of these 6, managed to whisper to his master towards the end of the meal, saying, "Sire, your Majesty will leave when you wish. The ship is waiting." He went out. The guests, astonished, looked at each other without uttering a single word, when another servant, coming up to his master, said to him, "Sire, your Majesty's chaise is in Padua, and the boat is ready." The master made a sign, and this servant also left. All the guests looked at each other again. A third valet, approaching a third foreigner, said to him, "Sire, believe me, your Majesty must not remain here any longer. I'll go and prepare everything." Immediately he disappeared. By now Candide and Martin had no doubt that this was a carnival masquerade. A fourth servant said to a fourth master, "Your Majesty will leave when you please," and went out like the others. The fifth valet said as much to the fifth master, but the sixth valet spoke differently to the sixth foreigner, who was sitting next to Candide. He said to him, "Sire, they won't give your Majesty any more credit, so we could well be locked up tonight.
but I'm going to see to my own affairs. Goodbye."
All the servants having disappeared, the 6 foreigners, Candide and Martin, remained in deep silence. Finally, Candide spoke. "Gentlemen, this is a singular jest. Is it true you're all kings? I freely admit that neither Martin nor I are kings." Cacambo's master then spoke up and said gravely in Italian,
"I am certainly not joking. My name is Ahmed III. I was Grand Sultan for several years. I dethroned my brother, but my nephew dethroned me. Then my viziers had their heads cut off, so now I'm ending my days in the old seraglio. My nephew, the Grand Sultan Mahmud, allows me to travel for my health, so I've come to spend the carnival in Venice."
The young man who was next to Ahmed spoke after him and said,
"My name is Ivan. I was emperor of all the Russias, but I was dethroned in my cradle. My father and mother were locked up while I was brought up in prison. Occasionally I'm allowed to travel, but only if accompanied by my guards. I too have come to Venice for the carnival."
The third spoke up.
"I am Charles Edward, King of England. My father ceded his rights to the kingdom, but I fought to maintain them. They tore out the hearts of 800 of my supporters and threw them back in their faces. I myself was put in prison, but now I am going to Rome to pay my respects to the king, my father. I also have come to spend the carnival in Venice."
The fourth then took the floor and said,
"I am king of the Poles. The fortunes of war have deprived me of my hereditary states, and my father also suffered the same ill luck. I too am at the mercy of Providence, like Sultan Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, and King Charles Edward, and I have come to spend the carnival in Venice."
The fifth said,
"I too am king of the Poles. I've lost my kingdom twice, but God has given me another state in which I've done more good than all the kings of smaller territories put together. I too have resigned myself to Providence, and like the others, I've come to spend the carnival in Venice."
Only the sixth monarch had not yet spoken.
"Gentlemen," he said, "I am not as great as you are, but even so I've also been a king. I am Theodore, elected King of Corsica. I, who have been called Your Majesty, am at present hardly called Sir. I've coined money, yet I do not have a penny. I've had 2 secretaries of state, and yet now I scarcely have a valet. I have come, like your majesties, to spend the carnival in Venice."
The 5 other kings listened to this speech with compassion. Each of them gave King Theodore 20 Venetian gold coins, with which to buy clothes and shirts, and Candide presented him with a diamond worth 2,000 gold coins. "Who is this man," asked the 5 kings, "who is in a position to give 100 times as much as each of us? Are you a king too, sir?" "No, gentlemen, and I have no desire to be," replied Candide honestly. At the moment they were leaving, there arrived in the same hotel 4 most serene highnesses, who had also lost their states through the fortunes of war. They too were in Venice for the carnival, but Candide took no notice of these newcomers, since he was now preoccupied with going to find his dear Kuniganda in Constantinople. The faithful Cacambo had already obtained the agreement of the Turkish captain who was to take Sultan Ahmed back to Constantinople to take Candide and Martin on his ship. Both came on board after having prostrated themselves before his miserable highness. On the way, Candide said to Martin, "Just think, we've just met 6 dethroned kings, and I've given every one of them money. Maybe there are many other princes still more unfortunate than they are. As for me, I've only lost 100 sheep, but now I'm speeding to Kuniganda. My dear Martin, once again Pangloss was right. All is well in the world."
"I sincerely hope so," replied Martin unconvincingly.
"But," continued Candide, "that was a most implausible adventure we had in Venice. No one ever saw or heard of 6 dethroned kings having supper in an inn together before." "That's no more extraordinary," said Martin, "than most of the things which have happened to us. After all, it's very common for kings to be dethroned. As for the honor of having supper with them, that's absolutely unimportant. What does it matter who you have supper with, provided you have a good meal?" Once Candide was aboard the ship, he threw his arms round the neck of his friend Cacambo. "Well," he asked, "what is Kuniganda doing? Is she still a great beauty? Does she still love me? How is she? No doubt you bought her a palace in Constantinople."
"My dear master," replied Cacambo, "Kuniganda is washing dishes on the banks of the river for a prince who actually has very few dishes, for she's a slave in the household of a former sovereign named Ragotsky of Transylvania, to whom the Grand Turk gives 3 crowns a day in his exile. But what is much sadder is that she has lost her beauty and become horribly ugly."
"Ah, beautiful or ugly," commented Candide, "I'm an honourable man, and my duty is to always love her. But how can she be reduced to so abject a state with the 5 or 6 million you gave her?"
"Well," explained Cacambo, "I had to give 2 millions to the governor of Buenos Aires for permission to take Mademoiselle Kuniganda back. Then a pirate carried off the rest. This pirate took us everywhere, to Cape Matapan, to Milo, to Nicaria, to Samos, to Petra, to the Dardanelles, to Naumura, and then finally to Centauri. Kuniganda and the old woman are servants of the prince I spoke of. I myself am the slave of the dethroned sultan."
"What a chain of frightful calamities, one after the other!" cried Candide. "However, I still have a few diamonds with which I shall deliver Kuniganda. It's a great pity that she's become ugly." Then, turning toward Martin, he asked, "Who do you think is to be the most pitied? Emperor Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, King Charles Edward, or I?"
"I cannot say," replied Martin, "for I would have to look inside your hearts to know the answer."
"Ah," said Candide, "but if Pangloss were here, he would know and be able to tell us."
I don't know with what sort of scales Pangloss could have weighed the relative misfortunes of man and measured their sorrows. All I presume is that there are millions of men on earth 100 times more pitiful than King Charles Edward, Emperor Ivan, or Sultan Ahmed.
"That might well be so," admitted Candide. Within a few days they arrived in the Bosphorus. Candide bought back Cacambo for a very high price. Then, without wasting time, he boarded a galley bound for Propontis to find Kuniganda, however ugly she might now be. In the convict crew there were 2 galley slaves who rowed very badly, and from time to time the Levantine captain applied a few strokes of a bull's pizzle to their bare shoulders. Candide, from a natural impulse, watched these galley slaves, and then approached them. Somehow their disfigured faces seemed to remind him of Pangloss, and of that hapless Jesuit, the Baron, Mademoiselle Kuniganda's brother. This idea touched and saddened him. He looked at them more attentively. "Truly," he said to Cacambo, "if I had not seen Dr. Pangloss hanged, and if I had not had the misfortune to kill the Baron, I would think that it was actually them rowing this galley." At the names the Baron and Pangloss, the 2 convicts uttered a loud cry, sat still on their bench, and dropped their oars. The Levantine captain ran after them and redoubled his lashes. "Stop! Stop, my lord!" ordered Candide. "I'll give you as much money as you want if you desist." "What? It's Candide!" cried one of the convicts. "What? It's Candide!" cried the other. "Is it a dream?" asked Candide. "Am I really awake? Am I really in this galley? Is that my lord the Baron whom I killed? Is that Dr. Pangloss whom I saw hanged?" "It is indeed," they both replied. "What? Is this that really great philosopher?" asked Martin. "Oh, Captain," asked Candide, "how much do you want to release my lord of Tundertentrunk, one of the premier barons of the empire, and Monsieur Pangloss, the most profound metaphysician of Germany?"
"Dog of a Christian," replied the Levantine captain. "Since these two dogs of Christian convicts are barons and metaphysicians, which is no doubt a great dignity in their country, you'll have to give me 50,000 gold pieces for them."
"You shall have them, sir. Take me back to Constantinople, and you'll be paid on the spot. But wait. First take me to Mademoiselle Kuniganda." So the Levantine captain quickly turned his prow towards the city, making the oarsmen row faster than ever. Candide embraced the Baron and Pangloss 100 times. "And how is it that I did not kill you, my dear Baron? And my dear Pangloss, how is it that you are alive after being hanged? And how do you both come to be in this galley, bound for Turkey?" Candide introduced Martin and Cacambo to them. They all embraced, all talking at once. The galley soon reached the port. They sent for a Jew, to whom Candide sold a diamond, valued at 100,000 gold pieces, for 50,000, who swore to Candide he couldn't possibly afford to pay any more for the jewel. Candide immediately paid the agreed ransom for the Baron and Pangloss. Then Candide immediately sent for 2 more Jews, to sell them more diamonds, so they could all set off again in another galley to go and deliver Kuniganda from her master. "Once again I ask your pardon," Candide said to the Baron. "Pardon me for having given you a great sword thrust through the body." "Let's say no more about it," replied the Baron. "I was a little too hasty. Since you want to know by what chance you came to find me in the galleys, I'll tell you. After being cured of my wound by the brother apothecary of the college, I was attacked and carried off by a party of Spaniards. They put me in prison in Buenos Aires just after my sister had left. Then I asked to return to the Father General in Rome, from where I was nominated to go to Constantinople to serve as almoner to the ambassador of France. Within a week of taking up my duties, I met a very attractive page to the Sultan. It was very hot, and the young man wanted to bathe, so I took the opportunity to bathe too. I did not know at the time that it's a capital offense for a Christian to be found stark naked with a young Moslem. A Mohammedan judge gave me 100 strokes on the soles of my feet and condemned me to the galleys. Now, I'd like to know why my sister is working in the kitchen of a sovereign of Transylvania who is now a refugee amongst the Turks." "But you, my dear Pangloss," said Candide, ignoring the Baron's question, "how can it be that I see you again?" "It's true that you saw me hanged," replied Pangloss. "Naturally, I was supposed to be burned, but you remember there was a heavy downpour just when they were going to cook me. In fact, the storm was so violent that they despaired of ever lighting the fire. So without burning me, a surgeon bought my body, took me home, and dissected me. First, he made a cross-shaped incision in me, from my navel to the clavicle. As it happened, the Holy Inquisition's executor of high operations, who burns people marvelously, was not accustomed to hanging them. The rope was wet and slipped badly. It became knotted. In short, I was still breathing when being taken down. This cross-shaped incision made me utter such a loud scream that my surgeon fell over backwards and, thinking he was dissecting the devil, fled. His wife came running in from a nearby room at the noise. She saw me stretched out on the table with my incision, and was even more afraid than her husband, and also fled. But when they had recovered a little, I heard the surgeon's wife say to her husband, "My dear, what were you thinking of, dissecting a heretic? Don't you know that the devil is always in those people? I'm going to get a priest to exorcise him." I shuddered at these words, and collected the little strength I had left to cry out, "Have pity on me!" Finally, the surgeon grew bolder. He sewed me back up, and his wife took care of me. In 2 weeks I was back on my feet. The surgeon found me a job and made me servant to a knight of Malta who was going to Venice. As this master had no money with which to pay me, I entered the service of a Venetian merchant and followed him to Constantinople. One day I had the notion to enter a mosque. There was no one there except an old man and a very pretty young devotee who was saying her prayers. Her bosom was fully uncovered, and between her breasts she had a beautiful bouquet of roses, tulips, anemones, buttercups, hyacinths, and yellow primroses. She dropped her bouquet, so I picked it up and replaced it for her with the utmost respect. However, I was so long in replacing it for her that the man grew angry, and seeing that I was a Christian, called for help. I was taken before the Mohammedan magistrate, who had me given 100 strokes on the soles of my feet and sent me to the galleys. I was chained in precisely the same galley and on the same bench as my lord the Baron. In this galley there were 4 young men from Marseille, 5 Neapolitan priests, and 2 monks from Corfu, who told us that similar adventures to ours occurred every day. My lord the Baron claimed that he had suffered a greater injustice than I. For my part, I claimed that it was much more permissible to replace a bouquet on a woman's bosom than to be found stark naked with a page to the Sultan. We were arguing unceasingly, and so received 20 strokes of the bullwhip a day. Then the concentration of events in this universe brought you into our galley. "Well, my dear Pangloss," said Candide, "when you were hanged, dissected, racked with blows, and rowing in the galleys, did you still think that all was for the very best?" "Yes, indeed, I'm still of my first opinion," replied Pangloss proudly. "For, after all, I am a philosopher, so it is not fitting for me to recant. Besides, re-established harmony is the finest thing in the world, like anything subtle." While Candide, the Baron, Pangloss, Martin, and Cacambo were telling their adventures, reasoning on the contingent or non-contingent events of this universe, arguing about the effects and causes, moral and physical evil, free will and necessity, and the consolations to be experienced in a Turkish galley, they landed on the shore of Propontis, near the house of the Prince of Transylvania. The first people they saw were Kuniganda and the old woman, spreading out towels on lines to dry. The Baron paled at the sight. The tender lover, Candide, on seeing his fair Kuniganda, dark-skinned, eyes bloodshot, flat-bosomed, cheeks wrinkled, arms red and rough, recoiled in horror. But then, recovering, advanced out of good manners. She embraced Candide and her brother. They embraced the old woman. Candide ransomed them both. There was a little farm in the neighborhood, and the old woman proposed to Candide that he buy it, while they all waited for a better destiny to arrive. Kuniganda did not know that she had grown ugly, for no one had told her so. She reminded Candide of his promises in so positive a manner that the good Candide could not refuse her. So he informed the Baron that he was going to marry his sister. "I can never permit it," replied the Baron, "with such baseness on her part and such insolence on yours. My sister's children would not possibly be allowed to enter the knightly assemblies of Germany. No, My sister shall marry only a baron of the empire." Kuniganda threw herself at her brother's feet and bathed them with tears, but he remained inflexible. "You maddest of madmen!" exclaimed Candide excitedly. "I rescued you from the galleys. I paid your ransom. I paid your sister's too. She was washing dishes. She is ugly. Now I'm kind enough to make her my wife, and yet you still presume to oppose it. I would kill you again if I were unable to control my anger." "You may kill me again," replied the Baron calmly, "but you shall not marry my sister while I'm alive." At the bottom of his heart, Candide had no desire to marry Kuniganda, but the Baron's extreme impertinence forced him to proceed with the marriage. Kuniganda urged him on so eagerly that he could not retract. He consulted Pangloss, Martin, and the faithful Cacambo. Pangloss composed a fine memoir by which he proved that the Baron had no rights over his sister, and that according to all the laws of the empire she could marry Candide. Martin's opinion was that they should throw the Baron into the sea, while Cacambo advised that the Baron should be returned to the Levantine captain to be put back into the galleys, after which he should be sent by the first available ship back to the Father General in Rome. This plan was considered very good, and the old woman approved of it, although they said nothing about it to Kuniganda. With a little money, their plan was carried out, so they had the pleasure of trapping a Jesuit and punishing the pride of a German baron. It would be quite natural to think that after so many disasters, Candide, married to his mistress, and living with the philosopher Pangloss, the philosopher Martin, the servant Cacambo, and the old woman, would lead the most pleasant life in the world. But he was so cheated by the Jews that he had nothing left but his little farm. His wife, becoming uglier every day, became shrewish and intolerable. The old woman was an invalid, and was even more bad-tempered than Kuniganda. Cacambo, who worked in the garden and who sold their vegetables in Constantinople, was worn out with work and cursed his destiny. Pangloss was in despair at not being able to shine at some university in Germany. As for Martin, he was firmly persuaded that a man is equally badly off anywhere. So he took things patiently. Candide, Martin, and Pangloss sometimes argued about metaphysics and morality. They often saw farm carts loaded with state officials, pashas, and judges who were being sent into exile at Lemnos, Mytilene, or Erzerum, passing under the windows. They saw other judges, pashas, and officials taking the place of the exiles, and they too were later exiled in their turn. They saw impaled heads on their way to the sublime port, leading to the gate of the Sultan's palace. These sights stimulated their discussions, and when they were not arguing, their boredom was so excessive that one day the old woman asked them, "I would like to know which is worse, to be raped 100 times by Negro pirates, run the gauntlet among the Bulgarians, be flogged and hanged in an auto-da-fe, be dissected, row in the galleys, or stay here, doing nothing?" "That is a very good question," agreed Candide. These remarks engendered new reflections, and Martin concluded that man was destined to live either with the torments of anxiety or the lethargy of boredom. Candide did not agree. Pangloss admitted that he had always suffered horribly, but having once maintained that everything was wonderful, he still maintained this opinion, though he did not really believe a bit of it. However, one event completely confirmed Martin in his principles, made Candide hesitate more than ever, and embarrassed Pangloss. For one day they saw Paquette and Friar Giroflee coming to their farm in a state of utmost misery. They had very quickly gone through their 3,000 pesos, then had parted, made up, quarrelled again, been put in prison, escaped, and finally Friar Giroflee had turned Turk. Paquette continued to ply her trade everywhere, but no longer earned anything at all. Did I not foresee, Martin stated to Candide, that your presence would soon be dissipated and would only make them more miserable? You and Cacambo were once overwhelmed by millions of pesos, and yet you are no happier than Friar Giroflee and Paquette. Aha, said Pangloss to Paquette. So heaven brings you back among us, my child. Do you realize that you cost me the end of my nose, one eye, and an ear? Oh, but look at you now. What a world this is. This adventure encouraged them to philosophize more than ever. In the neighborhood there was a very famous dervish who was considered the best philosopher in Turkey. They went to consult him. Pangloss acted as spokesman and said to him, Master, we have come to ask you to tell us why such a strange animal as man was created. What business is it of yours? Asked the dervish unhelpfully. But, Reverend Father, replied Candide, there is a dreadful amount of evil on earth. What does it matter whether there is evil or good? When His Highness sends a ship to Egypt, is he bothered about whether the mice in the ship are comfortable or not? Then what should we do? Asked Pangloss. Hold your tongue, replied the dervish. I flattered myself, continued Pangloss, that you and I would reason a bit together about effects and causes, the best of all possible worlds, the origin of evil, the nature of the soul, and pre-established harmony. At these words, the dervish shut the door in their faces. During this conversation, the news had gone round that in Constantinople 2 viziers of the Turkish Council of State had just been strangled, and that several of their friends had been impaled. These events caused a great stir everywhere. Pangloss, Candide, and Martin, returning to the little farm, came upon an old man enjoying the fresh air by his door under a bower of orange trees. Pangloss, whose curiosity was just as great as his love of reasoning, asked him the name of the mufti who had just been strangled. I know nothing about it, replied the man. I have never known the name of the mufti or of any vizier. I am entirely ignorant of the adventure you're telling me about. I presume that by and large those who meddle in public affairs will perish miserably, and they probably deserve it. I never inquire about what is going on in Constantinople. I simply content myself with enjoying the fruits of the garden I cultivate. Having said these words, he asked the strangers to come into his house. His 2 daughters and 2 sons presented them with several kinds of sherbets, which they had made themselves, Turkish cream, flavored with candied citron, oranges, lemons, limes, pineapples, pistachios, and mocha coffee. After which the 2 daughters of this good Moslem perfumed the beards of Candide, Pangloss, and Martin. You must have a vast and magnificent estate, remarked Candide to the Turk. No, I have only 20 acres, he replied. I cultivate them with my children. Work keeps away the 3 great evils, boredom, vice, and need. As Candide went back to his farm, he reflected deeply on the Turk's remarks. He said to Pangloss and Martin, That good old man seems to me to have made himself a life far preferable to that of the 6 kings with whom we had the honor of having dinner. Great eminence, said Pangloss, is very dangerous, at least according to the reports of all philosophers. For after all, Eglon, king of the Moabites, was assassinated by Ehud. Absalom was hanged by his hair and pierced with 3 darts. King Nabab was killed by Baasha. Other kings have become slaves. You know how Croesus perished, how Darius, Pyrrhus, Perseus, Caesar, Pompey, Nero, Richard II of England, Richard III, Mary Stuart, Charles I, the 3 Henrys of France, and the Emperor Henry IV died. You know, I also know, argued Candide, cutting him short, that we must cultivate our garden. You're right, replied Pangloss, for when man was put into the Garden of Eden, he was put there to work, which proves that man was not born to rest. Let us work with reason, agreed Martin. It's the only way to make life endurable. Thus everyone in this little society entered into this laudable plan. Each began to exercise his or her talents, and the little piece of land produced much. True, Kuniganda remained very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette embroidered. The old woman took care of the linen. No one, not even Friar Giroflee, failed to perform some service. And Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, "All events are linked together in the best of all possible worlds. For after all, if you had not been expelled from a fine castle with great kicks in the backside, as a result of that love for Mademoiselle Kuniganda, if you had not been subjected to the Inquisition, if you'd not travelled about America on foot, if you'd not given the Baron a great blow with your sword, if you'd not lost all your sheep from the good country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating candied citrus and pistachios." "Well said," agreed Candide. "For we must all cultivate our gardens."